2 alphas, 2 packs, 1 destiny. Cassidy Alma, an outcast and warrior, and Jake, a leader willing to do anything for his pack, are forced to join forces to face new enemies and old fears. Something more than an alliance erupts between them, an attraction that threatens to break down their barriers. Can they maintain their independence while protecting those they care about, or will their bond become a weakness that their enemies will turn against them? His hand wrapped around her waist, taking her weight, pulling her to his chest. She rested the side of her face against his shoulder as he nestled into her hair. It felt so natural, so logical, that for a moment she forgot the situation she was in, forgot that this was a stranger that she was now gliding around the dance floor with. It was as though they'd been practicing for years. "You're going to have to let me lead if this is going to work." His rough voice whispered against her neck, breath tickling her skin. She couldn't speak and was beginning to list to one side, so he held her tighter. She was pretty sure she was going to lose consciousness soon. "Stay with me, darlin'. If you pass out, every wolf in here is going to know about it." Her wolf growled in response as he put power behind his words. Her wolf, an alpha, refused to take instructions from anyone, least of all a strange wolf. Whilst the human side of her knew that he was helping her, her wolf didn't want to accept it. She wanted to run, escape, and survive. Though if she passed out in here like this, in front of a bar full of strangers, then even her pack wouldn't be able to help her. She wouldn't last long. Then what would happen to her pack? They'd become the property of whichever wolf dealt the final blow on her unconscious body. They wouldn't be safe without her. She needed to stay. Alive. Air. She whispered through cracked lips, her entire body rising and falling with the energy it took. "What was that, darlin'?" Her mysterious wolf replied. "Air, fresh air outside." She gasped, her eyes rolling as pain ricocheted through her body. "Right you are." Whirling her around so fast that she closed her eyes, they swept across the dance floor and towards the exit. Her eyes began to flutter shut as the dark, hazy cloud of pain descended behind her eyelids. "Stay awake just a little longer. Don't let these wolves know you're hurt. They'll kill you," the wolf repeated to her as he pushed down on the emergency exit bar. Her eyes snapped open, her head bobbing up as the emergency exit alarm went off. Everyone's eyes in the room were suddenly on the 2 alphas escaping out the back door. Amidst a collaboration of catcalls, he managed to get them both outside before slamming the door with his foot. "Not as subtle as I was hoping for, sorry," he whispered sheepishly. Heading for his truck, he held the mysterious alpha close in his arms. When she finally succumbed to the pain and passed out, he swept her legs out from under her and carried her bridal style to his truck, the car keys hanging between his teeth. Setting her gently into the passenger seat, he moved around to the driver's side and started up the engine, his headlights illuminating the deserted car park. Thank God it was deserted. He wasn't sure he'd know what to say to anyone who questioned his predicament at the moment. Admittedly, he was alpha, so could easily scare them off, but that wasn't how he liked to rule. He'd only come out to the bar tonight to wind down after a long day trying to broker peace with the pack. 2 counties over, some people just can't agree on anything. He definitely hadn't expected an out-of-towner to walk in, especially being that his pack lived in the middle of nowhere and didn't often get visitors. And he really didn't think that the wolf that wandered in would be an alpha. It wasn't common practice for an alpha to visit another pack's territory without announcing it, let alone without their pack, and yet here she was, all alone. When she'd walked in, she'd looked worried and brought with her the scent of vanilla and jasmine. His wolf had instantly sat up and paid attention for the first time in years. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to relax and have a drink in your local bar after a long day? And mind your own business when your inner animal is urging you to march over to the alpha, who clearly wasn't here to challenge him and introduce himself?" His wolf had done nothing but sit there and stare at her since the moment she'd walked in. Which is why he'd noticed when another strange wolf walked in, causing the she-alpha to freeze and look around helplessly, their eyes meeting momentarily before she rose from her seat down the bar and turned to see the stranger. By now, everyone was staring at the 2 wolves who silently spoke to one another, suggesting they were or used to be in the same pack. They didn't smell like they still were. She smelt of summer rain, where he smelt of the forest, but you never know. The strange wolf, a young pup with jet black hair and eyes to match, leaned forward and hugged the she-alpha before turning and walking out of the bar. If he hadn't been paying such close attention to her, he may not have seen how her body jerked or catch the faint smell of blood. However, as it was, his wolf was refusing to look away, so he saw as she turned around and clutched the bar to steady herself before she took a step forward. 1, 2, 3, and then she stumbled, but he was already there to catch her. He wondered briefly what would have happened if he wasn't there. Would she have collapsed in the middle of the makeshift dance floor? Which wolves would have pounced first from his pack? He had his suspicions. He knew Sullivan was itching to be an alpha, although he isn't strong enough and will never have enough power. Shelby, she could probably be alpha if she wanted. She certainly had the killer instinct to finish her off. Either way, he was surprised at how glad he was to get her out of there. His eyes drifted from the empty road in front of him, as they had many times during the drive. Illuminated by the flickering of passing street lights, the she-alpha slept fitfully, her forehead beginning to sweat. He knew that she was about to get a fever whilst her body fought off the injury. He still wasn't sure what the strange wolf had done, stabbed her, he supposed. He was only sure of one thing when he found out, and more importantly, when he found the wolf, he was going to kill him. She wasn't aware of much when she woke from the darkness, but she was sure she could smell bacon. To be honest, Cassidy hadn't expected to wake up full stop. She could vaguely remember the arms that had held her, the wolf that she missed without even knowing. Her wolf whined in protest as it caught a whiff of the bacon. She was hungry, very hungry. How long had she been out? More importantly, where was she? The room she was in didn't look like it was lived in. A spare room, she supposed. Taking a quick sniff, she recognized the alpha's scent. This must be his house. Easing herself off of the blue and white bed sheets, she grasped her side in pain as she made it to her feet. Fear tingled down her spine as she remembered the night before, but where were her girls? Were they safe? She knew she'd been followed, just as she'd known the second that he'd walked in that he was going to kill her. It would have been a clean kill as well. The other wolves in that bar would have torn her limb from limb. Yet that wolf, the alpha, he'd saved her. She took a step forward, grabbing the door frame for support, but then hands were there to hold her up. She looked up into his dark chocolate eyes and for a moment forgot the pain. They both stilled and remained so for a few beats before they snapped out of it, and he offered his arm to support her. "I could hear you up. You really need to rest, but I'm guessing you're hungry." He asked the she-wolf that he had his arm around. His wolf was particularly glad that he was this close to her, her blonde, brown, curly hair nestled against his chest. "Yes, very." She answered tightly. He could smell the pain coming off of her in waves, and his wolf stirred in anger. He'd spent all night tossing and turning on the sofa as he thought about what he'd do to that male wolf that hurt her if he ever found him. Well, that wasn't entirely true. He'd also spent a good portion of the night thinking about the she-wolf that was laid in his bed, just meters above him. In fact, he'd thought a lot about her, potentially too much. Twice he'd gotten up and had his foot on the bottom step on the old staircase before he realized what he was doing. Helping her down the stairs, taking it slowly, he led the she-wolf into his kitchen, seating her at the breakfast bar. Grabbing the frying pan off of the stove, just as it began to catch, he dropped it into the sink and then collected the 2 plates of food that he'd spent a ridiculously long time making. As he set the piled plate down in front of the hungry she-wolf and poured them both mugs of coffee, he briefly thought back to his time spent in this house. Had he ever cooked breakfast? In fact, had he ever eaten at this breakfast bar? Opting instead to eat out of a tin in front of the TV or grab a quick lunch at Darcy's diner down the road. In fact, he was pretty sure that he'd spent more time leaning on the bonnet of whatever car he was fixing that day, gnawing on an oil-stained sandwich than he had sat at this breakfast bar. And yet here they were, eating in relative silence, muttering only to ask one another for the salt or the ketchup. It didn't take them long to clear their plates as if acting out of routine, which was anything but the truth. Jake stood and cleared the plates away, dropping them into the sink. He turned back around and leaned against the side, his wolf watching eagerly as the she-wolf stretched her arms high above her head, before wincing slightly and settling back in her chair, hugging her coffee mug. All the thoughts that had been momentarily running through his wolf's mind vanished as the she-wolf winced. An unfamiliar anger settled in his gut as he swirled his coffee mug in circles. Silence had fallen and stayed for a good few minutes before Jake spoke up. "Want to tell me what that was all about?" His voice, like gravel, echoed through her body. Cassidy adjusted herself on the chair slightly and shrugged in discomfort. She didn't really want to air her dirty laundry to this stranger wolf. Sure, she would be eternally grateful to him. He'd saved her life. But she was hardly going to thank him by putting his life in jeopardy. In fact, she needed to get out of here, needed to find her girls and make sure they were okay, and then they all needed to disappear before he found out that she was still alive. "There's nothing to tell. I must have caught myself on his jacket or something." She lied. Badly. The alpha barked a laugh and stomped forward. She saw his wolf flash in his eyes and felt a wave of power crash over her, which her wolf, had she been in full health, would have counteracted, but she was weak, weaker than she'd realized. "Want to try that again?" He asked tightly, his voice ghosting up her skin, giving her goosebumps. She didn't know what it was about this wolf, but there was something about him that was calling to her on another level. Shaking off the strange feeling, she narrowed her eyes at him. She was alpha. Nobody ever questioned her. Aware that he'd saved her life, she decided not to fight him. "Look, I don't want you to get mixed up in this, okay?" She placed down her coffee cup and made to stand up, but he was there, helping her out of the seat, guiding her towards the sofa. It was not what she'd planned. She'd planned to tell him that she was going to leave, that she needed to find her pack, and that she was very grateful but had to go. She'd planned to say all that. Instead, she said, "I'm so tired." As if in understanding, she felt his wolf growl in his chest as she leaned against him as they crossed over into the living room. "Rest here for a while. I'm going to go and fetch Doc and see if he'll come check your wound." Rather than telling him it wasn't necessary and assuring him that she could be on her way, she silently sunk into the sofa, leaning against the pillow that was left there. In fact, she realized now that it was made up like a bed. Had he slept here last night? Why didn't he sleep in his own room? Surely that was the spare room she'd been in. "I'll be right back, okay?" The gravel-voiced wolf told her, Cassidy's eyes already slipping closed. Nodding, she yawned and curled into a ball on the warm sofa, enjoying the scent nestled into the cushions. Within a moment, she was sound asleep. He watched her for a moment, his wolf not wanting to leave her side anyway. She looked so peaceful as she slept curled into his pillow tightly. Lingering for just a moment longer, he headed out to town, aware of the dark red patch that was beginning to form on her side. He thought he'd healed her properly last night, but it would seem that the wound was getting worse. Cassidy's sleep was restless, a mixture of nightmare eyes and gaping black holes as her brain sifted through the last year of her life. So much had changed, so much had been lost. All of it destroyed by an alpha wolf, hell-bent on owning her, demolishing her power and taming her wolf. She woke on a silent scream as pain burned bright through her body. Unfamiliar scents, sounds, and sights assaulted her. Her eyes refused to focus, showing her a shadowy world of smudges. She fought against hands that held her down, her voice too hoarse to scream out at the pain. She was sure they were killing her. She could hear a voice, calm and patient, telling her to breathe and to relax. Did the voice think that she, Cassidy Alma, alpha of the Rootbridge pack, wouldn't fight until her bitter end? Did it think that she would roll over and play dead? She'd escaped worse than this voice, worse than them all. Cassidy would have scoffed at the placating voice if her vocal cords allowed, but instead she simply fought harder, nails digging into flesh as binding hands pulled away. "I can't help her like this," a voice cried. Help! They thought they were helping. She would never give in, she would never let Cain win. "Trank her?" a voice asked, quickly chased by a growled no from a voice more beast than man. For a second, the growled voice seemed to chase the pain away. For a moment, everything was peaceful, and then the pain returned, with a renewed force. A brutal scream tore past her lips, burning through her throat. Cassidy didn't stop her fight, and sensing a jumble of movement, she saw her moment and took it. Hands flew from her skin as she twisted in their grasp. Her eyes, still unable to make out forms, showed her blocks of merging colors. With claws for fingers, Cassidy batted at any approaching hands as the scent of fresh blood filled the room, pleasing her wolf. She knew her eyes had shifted to wolf when the world lost color, but the smudges remained. Following her wolf's instincts, she sluggishly got to her feet and went to take a step, blindly fumbling through wherever she was. Her foot had barely touched the ground before a sharp sting in her neck made her wolf howl. She raised her clumsy hands and tried grasping the cool metal that hung from her, but just as her fingertips graced the curve of metal, the entire world appeared to shift on its axis. Or maybe she'd just fallen over. As her torso thudded against something hard and metal and her head suffered a similar fate, she realized that, she'd been hit with a tranquilizer. Well, at least she wasn't dead. Yet, his wolf paced backwards and forwards within him, angry, frustrated, and most importantly, worried. Every instinct in Jake told him to go the she-wolf and hold her, to push Doc out of the way as violently as necessary and hold what was his. He shook his head and continued pacing back and forth across the room, just like his wolf was. His wolf growled inside him and for a moment lunged to the surface, aiming to get control. Jake hardened his jaw and forced his wolf back down again. What was this she-wolf doing to him? Jake and his wolf lived in relative peace. It came with the power. As an alpha, Jake had to be in control of his wolf as he was responsible for grounding the pack. He was sure that his pack mates were sensing his wolf's anger and his internal turmoil right now. Jake's gaze swept across the room and caught the stare of his beta. Liam Kingston had been Jake's best friend in school, and so when Jake had taken over from his father as alpha, Liam seemed like the obvious choice for his right-hand man. But right now, Jake was regretting that choice because Liam knew him. Knew him too well, in fact. In that long, hard stare from Liam, Jake could read just how concerned he was about Jake's reaction to the she-wolf. It was unusual and certainly out of character. Jake had never been celibate, but he also had never been serious about any female before. In fact, for the last 4 years or so, his wolf hadn't shown any interest in anybody, and Jake had followed suit. Being an alpha didn't exactly make room for relationships. But as Jake watched the she-wolf's eyes flickering behind closed lids, as Doc tried to clear out the wound, Jake had a feeling somewhere deep inside that everything was about to change. He'd never been possessive, and he knew that Doc served as no threat to him or his she-wolf, yet watching as his aged hands deftly worked on her wound, his blood was beginning to boil. He looked away, running a hand through his hair, and began pacing again. A heavy hand landed on his shoulder, pausing him mid-stride. His eyes snapped up to Liam, his wolf not liking the hand on his shoulder. Again the wolf lunged forwards, and Jake had to fight to hold him in. Sensing the inner turmoil, Liam removed his hand but inclined his head towards the front door, steady eyes watching his alpha. Jake knew he wanted to talk, and knew that he should probably go and do so, but he just couldn't quite leave the she-wolf yet. Not whilst she was here in a room full of male wolves. Male wolves that he trusted, some of which were mated, but all of which would respect his boundaries. Sighing, which came out as more of a growl than he'd expected, Jake swept a hand through his hair again and then nodded at Liam, who began heading for the front door. The room was silent as they headed out, all eyes swiveling to the alpha. He paused as he took the door that Liam held open and looked briefly over his shoulder. He looked to Doc, who was still working to clear the wound on his she-wolf. She'd been poisoned, according to the doc, with some kind of the silver-based knife. It was currently working its way through her system, but Doc had promised he'd do his best to keep it at bay. The logical side of Jake reminded him that she had a fever, which meant that was healing. But the majority of Jake was still worried as hell that he might lose her. Dragging his eyes from the peaceless face of the she-wolf, Jake glared at the wolves around the room and shifted his shoulders, sending a wave of power across the room. She was not to be touched. The wolves responded by ducking their eyes and nodding their heads, understanding his command but questioning his reasoning. They all agreed to stay away but to protect her if needed. Satisfied and his wolf partly calmed, Jake turned and walked out of his house, making sure to leave the front door slightly ajar so that he could keep an eye on what was happening. As he turned to Liam, he was surprised by the animosity in his gaze. Jake bit his tongue as his wolf lunged to the surface at the insubordinate tone in Liam's voice. It was a physical strain to keep a lid on his wolf, his hands curling into fists, nails piercing the palm of his hand. His wolf longed to grab Liam by the throat in a display of dominance and have him submit until he remembered his place in this pack, Jake's pack. Sensing the inner turmoil, Liam adjusted his hunched posture and took a step back. "Alpha," he corrected. "What is going on? Who is this wolf?" "I've never seen you like this." Jake turned from him, his attention drifting back through the door and into the room. I can sense your fear, your panic across the pack link. We all can. Who is she? Jake forced himself to focus on Liam. Frustration ticked in the back of his mind. He wished he could give Liam an answer that would explain away all of his behavior, but honestly, he didn't know what was going on. All he knew was that the she-wolf on the other side of that door meant more to him than even he realized. I don't know her, she just appeared on pack territory. She's injured, so we're offering her safety. His voice clipped and tone laced with anger. I know all about the bar, I heard about it. Everyone has, even Eleanor. Jake's eyes snapped up to Liam's face. Worry clawed at the wolf's face. A tension had settled around his eyes. Jake swore under his breath and ran a hand through his hair, pinned by Liam's gaze. She's an outsider who turned up on pack territory, and yet you're putting her safety above ours. When the wolf that attacked her realizes that she's not dead, he'll come for her and all of us. We should get her healed up enough that she'll survive and then get her out of here. The growl caught Jake off guard as much as it did Liam. Within seconds, Jake's wolf had lunged to the surface and forced Liam backwards until his spine met the wall of the house. Jake's eyes had gone full wolf now as he leant into Liam's face, lips pulled back to expose his canine teeth. It was the wolf that spoke now, his voice a shade lower, his eyes an unnatural yellow. Say that again and I'll tear your throat out. Responding to the threat, Liam's own eyes flash yellow before he fought to restrain his wolf. Seeing the conflict in his friend's eyes broke the moment and allowed Jake to regain control. He blinked and stepped back, releasing Liam from his hold. He let out a long sigh and once again ran a hand through his hair. I'm sorry, Liam, but the she-wolf stays until I'm sure the threat to her is over. That isn't optional. She's safe. His words were drowned out by a blood-curdling scream that sent fear shooting down Jake's spine. Lunging into the house, his wolf at his back, Jake paused at the scene. His she-wolf screamed and fought as 3 of his men tried to hold her down, whilst Doc sat back on his heels on the floor and watched the scene with a mixture of surprise and horror. I can't help her like this, he cried as his gaze landed on Jake. Frozen between the anger at the hands on his she-wolf, surprise at her strength and fear that something awful had happened to her, Jake could only watch on. Behind him, Liam had walked back in unnoticed until he suggested trank her. As he eyed the trank gun Jake kept in the corner, Jake's no chased Liam's voice as an anger pitted itself in his stomach. The she-wolf instantly quietened and Jake released a breath, thinking that maybe the worst was over. The room gave a collective sigh of relief before the tricky she-wolf twisted out of their grip and claws caught skin. Doc darted backwards, having tried to return to his work, now cradling a bleeding arm. The others moved away as she tore at the air, eyes burning yellow. In 3 strides, Jake had grabbed the gun from where it had leant against the wall for as long as Jake could remember before he spun around and pulled the trigger. By the time the dart hit her, and she'd succumbed to the serum, Jake had reached her side and caught her body as it fell towards the ground. Sweeping her legs from underneath her, he carried her back to the sofa, where Doc stood tending his own wounds. Laying her down, he looked around the room at the state his wolves were in. He could feel their annoyance with him and fear of her. He ground his teeth and flexed his fists, struggling to contain a rage he didn't know he owned. We should get the healer. No, Jake snapped at Liam, narrowing his eyes at him. They were normally on the same page, so this new sense of annoyance at his closest friend was beginning to unsettle Jake. Liam's right, Jake. Doc echoed, as he laid an old, weathered hand on his shoulder. I can't heal her now. She's made her wounds worse and that trank won't hold her forever. I know it's awkward, but no. Please, son. Doc urged as he moved to stand in front of Jake, his aged eyes steadily staring at him, unwavering despite the anger Jake knew he held within his irises. Eventually, Jake's reluctance subsided as worry for the she-wolf took over. He hung his head and released a long, slow breath. Fine. Trevor, go fetch Eleanor. Trevor, one of his most loyal wolves, nodded and took off at pace. I hope I don't regret this, Jake said to Doc as the old man chuckled and moved towards the she-wolf. I'm sure someone will. Jake tried not to pace as Doc worked. Liam had disappeared and the other wolves had granted Jake and Doc some space, but he could sense them lingering nearby. With every step he took, his eyes fought to settle on the she-wolf. She had fallen quiet, too quiet, and it was sending his wolf into overdrive. Watching Doc work sent Jake into a trance as his skillful hands tended to the wound, yet it seemed that the more he tried to fix it, the worse it would get. The knowledge that Eleanor was on her way was beginning to eat at Jake's mind. The possessive worry for the she-wolf momentarily diluted as the annoyance at seeing Eleanor trickled in. The pack healer, Eleanor, seemed to think that her and Jake were meant to be, despite his insistence that he had no interest. Jake had heard of her type before, the ones not strong enough to be alpha, yet not weak enough to settle for anything less. They'd always try to mate up as his mother would tell him, along with a stern warning to avoid that kind of person. Impatience ticked within his body as the minutes stretched out endlessly. Her scream tore through the infinite silence, and Jake visibly winced at the sound. In panic, his wolf lunged to the surface, and Jake, too distracted to control him, couldn't restrain the beast this time. Caught somewhere between man and wolf, his eyes slid to a deep yellow and claws burst from his human hands. His posture, more hunched than before, was more animalistic than man. As long, sharp teeth slid out under his lips, Jake's control snapped into place, pausing the transformation from going any further. Yet no matter how hard he tried, he could not put the beast back in his cage this time. The she-wolf had screamed out in pain, but was now moaning in agony as she feebly fought Doc's hands from her wound. The sweat from the fever had increased, causing droplets to form on her forehead. The sounds she made were guttural, Jake's wolf feeling the pain more than hearing it, especially in his altered state. In that moment, Jake wanted nothing more than to go to her, to help her. But as he helplessly glared at his wolf-like hands, he realized that going near her in this state would probably only hurt her more. As though sensing his dilemma, Doc spared him a glance over his shoulder, the shock evident on the old man's face. "She'll be fine," he insisted as his hands returned to the she-wolf, a syringe sliding into her skin. "Once Eleanor's here, she'll be fine. I've given her pain medication that'll help take the edge off. I need you to calm down, Jake." The fear in his friend's voice surprised Jake, and it was only then, as the scent of fear washed off of Doc and the wolves situated just outside the house, that Jake realized he was growling. Cut short like a stalled engine, silence chased Jake's anger from the room. Taking deep breaths, like he'd been taught as a child, Jake focused on relaxing and easing himself back into his human form. As children, wolves would often struggle with the transformation, their wolf fighting for dominance. Jake had struggled the most due to the strength of his wolf, yet once he'd learned to control it, he'd never looked back until today. Just as he regained control and his eyes shifted back to human, the world regaining its color, the door burst open. Liam came first, his eyes seeking Jake's, a message shared between the two of them. He was followed by the stench of daisies, which always made his lip curl. "Jackie," a honey-sweet voice purred, as Eleanor stalked into the room. "What's this I hear about a visitor?" All smiles and cheer, she struggled to hide the jealous streak that flashed across her features as she spied his she-wolf laying on the couch. In the background, he saw Liam fighting a smile, before his expression returned to serious. He watched as Doc cleaned up the abandoned medical waste and stood to his feet, grunting with the effort. Doc moved around the couch and stood beside Liam, watching Eleanor with a measured expression, whilst absently wiping his hands on a towel. "Eleanor." Jake grunted, wishing, not for the first time, that he hadn't made the mistake of kissing her on New Year's Eve, 3 years ago. Eleanor sashayed towards him, eyes only for him, a possessiveness she didn't own in her eyes. As she reached him, her hand traced him from shoulder to wrist, her hand squeezing his. A low, aggressive growl rumbled across the room, freezing Eleanor in her tracks and sending a shiver through Jake's wolf. A wave of power followed the low growl. Although she was weakened, his she-wolf still packed a punch. His wolf howling in pride inside him, Jake fought back a smug smile as Eleanor averted her gaze downwards, the physical strain of the dominant power evident in her stance. He left Eleanor struggling beneath his she-wolf's power for a moment, maybe two, before he rolled his shoulders and sent his own wave of power back, indicating to the she-wolf that he was alpha here, whilst ensuring he wasn't challenging her. His she-wolf didn't make another sound and had relaxed back into the sofa. Yet Jake was acutely aware of the color of her skin, her face slightly too pale and her forehead clammy. Whatever she'd been poisoned with has been deadly. Before his anger was able to consume him, Eleanor's shrill voice distracted him. "I'll heal her if I can, Jakey, but I don't know why you want me to bother. She's not even one of our wolves." She waved her hand flippantly at Doc's silent protest to her words, but froze in her tracks at the deadly tone of Jake's voice. "Mine." The room took in an audible breath, as Liam gave Doc an alarmed glare. Jake realized they thought he was claiming her, though his wolf wouldn't have minded and was actually really on board with that happening. He could claim her now and then when she's healed. They'd mate and have tiny wolf cubs, and Liam cleared his throat. "I mean, they're my wolves. It's my pack. I say who we do and don't heal an eye as your alpha." Guilt flashed through Jake's mind as his words echoed painful memories. "And I say you heal her, so do as you're told," he demanded, his tone level but insistent and his words backed by a wave of power. Eleanor, eyes firmly fixed on the floor, nodded silently and set about healing the she-wolf. The tension broke in the room as Eleanor began telling the other wolves what she'd need. Bestowed with the ability to heal, Eleanor was able to use the lifeblood and magic of her werewolf ancestors and rare herbs to heal other wolves. However, it always came at a cost, namely to her power level, so she always required access to food, drink, and a nap. Jake walked away from the chaotic scene and walked into the kitchen, shaking hands, plucking a glass from the cupboard and filling it with water. As he sipped from the glass, his eyes met his own in the reflection of the window, yet it was not his face that he was met with. Instead, it was a memory of his father. Pain ricocheted through his chest as his eyes traced his father's familiar features. The hard line of his chin and the way his mouth was always twisted. He'd hated his father, from the moment he was old enough to understand his cruelty, to the moment he watched the last breath of life leave his body. A cruel alpha who led with fear and punishment, Jake had challenged him at a young age and had won. Ever since then, he'd fought to be a better man than his father ever was. Yet look at him now. Disgust quickly built within him, and without thinking he threw the glass into the sink, breaking the spell. His own face glared back at him along with Liam's concerned face. Jake spun around to face his beta, knowing there was a lecture coming his way, but thankfully Eleanor spoke up. "I'm ready. I'm going to need some help. There's extensive damage. You're going to need to hold her down." Eleanor lingered by the door as Liam held it open, knuckles turning white with the force of his restraint as Eleanor tried once again to convince Jake that now that the she-wolf was healed, she should leave. Crouched beside the sleeping she-wolf, Jake leant against the coffee table. Both Eleanor and Doc had assured him that the she-wolf would be fine, but his wolf remained restless. The evening was drawing in, and through the open door, past the insistent body of Eleanor, Jake could see his pack beginning to gather. Routinely, his eyes flickered to the clock that hung above the abandoned fireplace that his mother had insisted she wanted, but never had the time to use. Jake didn't need to check the time or see his pack gathering. His wolf knew that the moon was rising. It called to him like nothing else in this earth and gave his already restless wolf another reason to be on edge. Just before the full moon each month, his pack would hunt together. It was a ritual, his pack's ritual, and one that he had never missed, canceled, or delayed. Every fiber in his body wanted to cancel tonight's. Even his wolf seemed keen, which surprised Jake. It was the one time that Jake really felt like a wolf, so akin with nature and at one with his pack. Leaving the ticking hands, Jake's attention returned to the she-wolf. He didn't want to leave her, not whilst she was still unconscious, but he had a duty as alpha to do so. He'd already let his pack down today. He couldn't face himself if he did it again. Part of being alpha is never getting the chance to be truly selfish. Yes, his wolf wanted to curl up at her feet like a house cat, but Jake could also sense the need to run within him. A primal need. His wolf needed to be released, to feel the earth beneath his paws. Sensing the turmoil within his alpha, Liam caught his attention and signaled for them to talk in the kitchen. Eleanor was long forgotten and was knocked back with the front door as Liam let go. With a grunt, a snarl, and a throwaway comment about the state of the pack, she left Jake's house. The tension seemed to spill out of the room with her exit, and Jake felt the tiniest bit of control return to him. "You can't cancel the hunt." Jake studied Liam's face for a moment, leaving his beta to sweat. "I know." he admitted, his hand running through his hair as he looked down at the ground and shifted on the balls of his feet. "I need you to stay here." "I know," Liam replied in a similar tone to Jake. "You want someone with her at all times." Almost embarrassed to admit it, Jake's swift nod was all he'd give to confirm it. "I'm going to go and round up the pack." "I'm sorry, Liam," he promised as he met his beta's eyes for the first time. Liam gave him a short smile and nod before clapping him on the back. "It'll be fine. It might give me a chance to work out what you think is so special about her." Both men fell into silence as their attention turned to the peaceful she-wolf, unaware that she was healing quicker than they'd realized. She waited patiently until the wolves had all filtered out, except for one. The one that had been nominated as her guard she hadn't been aware of much, but knew it was dark outside, the moon high in the sky, calling to her wolf. She tried not to move or give away that she was awake. The alpha from this morning had taken his pack on a hunt, leaving her with his beta. A chance, she thought, to escape. Knowing she needed to put some distance in between herself and this pack, for their sake as much as hers, she decided to try to sneak out without the beta realizing. However, as he picked up a magazine and began to noisily flick through the pages, she realized it probably wasn't going to be that easy. A flash, quick and darting, unreachable. Jake's wolf stopped in its tracks, paws skidding through loose undergrowth. A scent, soft and sweet, filled his nostrils as his wolf drank in the familiar smell. His she-wolf. Taking off at a pace, his wolf abandoned the deer he'd been chasing, leaving his pack whining behind him. She was fast, very fast, faster than him, but this was his territory. He knew it like the back of his hand. For the last 30 years he'd hunted these woods, and so he knew firsthand how disorientating they could be. His she-wolf didn't stand a chance of escaping him. Leaving her running north, further into his territory, Jake took a sharp left and headed west, knowing he could cut her off by the lake. Sure enough, as the glistening water came into view, silvered by the moonlight, the she-wolf appeared from the tree line, slipping, tripping, and tumbling as she tried to stop herself from hitting the water. Seizing her moment of confusion, Jake launched himself towards the she-wolf. Teeth bared and claws outstretched, she turned to meet his leap. Thudding into her side, he sent the two of them flying through the undergrowth where they grappled for dominance until Jake was finally able to pin her down. Refusing to submit, her wave of power sent the wolves that had followed him, skidding back a few steps. Jake matched it with his own, but in the back of his mind knew this was not what he wanted. He didn't want to battle the she-wolf. He realized in that moment he wanted to keep her. Slowly, steadily, Jake released the she-wolf and gave her some space. Once a fair distance away, he transformed back into human, his bones and joints popping back into place. After a few disorientating moments, Jake was human again. Sensing the predator in the she-wolf, he raised his hands in surrender and calmly told his pack to back off of them via the pack link. The world beat slowly between them as time trickled by. After what felt like an eternity, the she-wolf's fur began to recede until a human body remained. Wide, hazel-brown eyes drank him in before she spoke, her voice ghosting across his skin. "I'm Cassidy. Cassidy Alma. I'm the alpha of the Rootbridge pack." Like a teenager, Jake stumbled through a hello, cursing himself at the pathetic wave he followed it up with. He cleared his throat. "I'm Jake. It's a pleasure to finally, properly meet you." A day. She promised to stay for one day. Following the alpha tackling her during her escape, which on reflection was maybe ill thought out, she'd been formally introduced to the alpha, his beta, and a few of the other pack members, including one of the wolves who'd tried to save her. She'd explained she had to leave, for their sake and hers, but the alpha, Jake, had convinced her to stay, stating that Doc, who was also a doctor, wanted her to stay for one day, just so that they could keep an eye on her. By the surprise that flickered across Doc's face, Cassidy would place money on the fact that it was the first time Doc had heard that, but she let the alpha off. Despite needing to find her girls and wanting to put distance between this pack and her, Cassidy knew these people had saved her life, and that although she was healed, she was still tired. So staying one day to appease a worried alpha, what harm would that do? "You have a healer?" she asked casually as they continued the walk back towards the alpha's house. She'd been lent a jacket by the beta, Liam, when he'd noticed the alpha getting annoyed at the staring eyes. That was the one problem with transforming from human to wolf and back again. Clothes never made it in one piece. Jake, the alpha, turned his attention to her, as he had done many times whilst they walked. He seemed hesitant to respond, blowing a long breath out between his teeth. "Yay, we do. Talkative, this one." She nodded in response and kept walking, her wolf keeping a mental record of the layout of his territory. "I'd like to thank them. They saved my life," she admitted, tucking a piece of hair behind her ear. "Yay, yay." Jake stuttered, a chuckle from Liam stealing her attention. The house came into sight and a whisper of home echoed through Cassidy's wolf. She was surprised, really, at how good she felt. Sure, the healer had done a great job, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As they reached the front door and Jake opened it, letting her go in first, a realization hit her. She felt safe. She, Cassidy Alma, actually felt safe. His wolf remained hyper-aware of the she-wolf as she walked absently around his living room. The pack had finished the hunt alone, whilst Jake and Cassidy returned to his house, Liam by his side. Every now and then, a bolt of need would shoot through Jake, right to his core. His wolf, despite being quiet now, kept lunging to the surface, demanding that he go to the she-wolf. What his wolf wanted him to do when he got there, he didn't want to know. Now they sat in his living room, a few other pack members had joined them, not trusting the new wolf. Jake relaxed back into his armchair, one leg kicked up over the other, his ankle resting on his knee. A cool beer was slowly going warm in his right hand. Normally, an ice-cold beer would solve anything, yet today it wasn't quite scratching Jake's itch, but he had a damn good idea what could. She paused her pace around the room, lightning, fast eyes seeking him out. A mischievous smile seemed to find its place permanently on her face. Temptation in human skin. Jake could not shake the memory of her, naked beneath him in the forest, only them and nature. Jake adjusted his position in the chair and forced himself to look away from the she-wolf and check on his pack. Doc stood in his kitchen, a tea towel hanging from his weathered hands. Routinely, his mate, Darcy, would pass him a mug or plate, which he'd dry up and then place beside him. Every now and then, Doc's eyes would drift to Darcy as they continued their private conversation. Each time Darcy's laugh carried across the room, Jake could feel the wave of love emanating from Doc. He liked seeing them like this, relaxed and happy. A darkness that Jake could never escape briefly stole his attention, absorbing him entirely until the room had drifted to nothing more than background noise. 3 years ago. She woke on a startled breath, her wolf at her skin, pushing for dominance. Danger flashed through her mind as she leapt from her bed, claws already unsheathed and teeth ready to shred. He stood, nonchalantly, against the side of her tent, arrogance rolling from him in waves. She hadn't seen him for a couple of months, not since the day he'd not for a while. Cassidy swallowed a lump in her throat and bit her tongue, forcing herself to focus on her pack link, at the chaos that gnawed at the edge of her mind. Her pack wasn't large, only about 20 in total, but she knew without tapping too far into the link that it was in utter meltdown at the devastation and destruction. As images from the minds of her pack filtered through her own, Cassidy forced the bile from her throat and rounded on Cain. A man she'd grown up with, under the tyrant that was his father, she'd always known that one day this day would come. The day when she would need to kill the son of the alpha she'd despised, of the alpha she'd challenged, of the alpha she'd beaten. Cain's cocky face unsettled her. He knew as well as she did that she was stronger than he was, and yet in the dead of night he'd chosen to attack her pack with his own. Pull them from their beds and force them to submit to him as alpha or lose their lives. Now he stood there, obviously needing to challenge her as alpha in order to take over the pack, but why had he chosen today? Even in the dead of night, he was no challenge for her. Pushing the complex thoughts to the back of her mind as the screams of her pack mates ramped up from around her, Cassidy knew that it was time to kill Cain, to end this madness. They met in a clash of teeth and claw as tooth caught bone and drew blood. Cassidy's wolf snarled in victory. Momentarily wounded but not defeated, Cain's wolf put distance between them and began to circle Cassidy, looking for her weakness, but he should have known her better than that. Faking to the right and charging from the left, Cassidy had just managed to wrap her teeth around his jaw when the scream tore across the night. She wasn't even sure if it had been as loud as it sounded, carried to her on a lucky wind, and yet it could have happened next to her for the clarity of pain in that call. Lee. She ground out from between her clenched teeth. Acting more on instinct than intention, she leapt past Kane and scrambled over barriers, benches, and even the fire pit until she ended up in the clearing in the middle of her pack's territory. Around her, their homes burned brightly in the night's shadows. The sounds of their forest were drowned out by the screams of her pack, but she only had eyes for one wolf in that moment. She recognized him from before the packs had split. He walked with a limp and had lost half an eye last time they fought. As Kane's beta, Jackson was a wolf not to be trifled with unless, like Cassidy, you were much stronger than he was. Unfortunately, though, it was not Cassidy's throat that he held in his clawing grip, it was her best friend, one of her first friends during the early days under the wicked Alpha Harrison. Anger pitted itself in her stomach as she glared at the wolf that held her friend. Tenseness rolled off of her and lashed at her wolf's control. The anger rose through her body, sparking out across her like lightning in a dark sky. Every nerve ending hummed with her anger, with her pain. Her pack was in disarray. Kane had come prepared. He had more wolves than when he'd last tried this. This time he wasn't so relenting. He sauntered towards her, acting as though moments ago she hadn't had her teeth clasped around his neck, ready to kill. A cocky grin owned his face as he raked his eyes up and down her. Stood here in the night's wind, she hadn't noticed that she was only in little sleeping shorts and a camisole. But he had. Cass, he purred, causing bile to collect in her throat. It doesn't have to be this way. Let her go. She didn't address Kane. Instead, her attention remained on the wolf that held Lee. Cass, come on. All you need do is submit to me, and I said. Let her go. Her voice like ice sliced through the night. Hesitation flickered through Jacken's stance as she sent alpha waves at him. She saw him stumble, but to regain his footing he used Lee, slicing her skin as he did so. As the smell of blood hit her, her wolf lunged to the surface and Cassidy, caught off guard, couldn't contain her. Her wolf lunged for control and seized it, transforming mid-leap. Hitting the man who held Lee square in the chest, Cassidy sent him tumbling backwards as she snarled and bit at his soft flesh. Through her pack link, Cassidy tried to tell Lee to run, but she wasn't sure she'd heard her. Lost in an ocean of wolves, Cassidy fought and fought for as long as she could, until suddenly she felt a sharp shot in her hind leg. Whirling around, she saw Kane in human form with two of his wolves. They each held guns of some kind and began picking off Cassidy's wolves one by one. The world began to quake beneath her feet and she slipped to the side, realizing too late that they'd drugged her. Her last conscious thought was that she about to die. She stared at the wood-paneled ceiling. Once again, she counted from 1 to 100, then started again. Count sheep, her father would tell her as a child, that'll help you sleep. Or just make me hungry. She'd always reply. Sadness clawed at her heart, so she rolled over onto her side and glared out of the window. After their little moment, or accident as she kept telling herself, Jake had insisted that she should rest whilst his wolves went to investigate the outsiders that had been spotted. Evening had quickly turned to night, and there had been no word. Cassidy sighed deeply as once again the front door opened and somebody new walked in. She had been listening to the sound of Jake pacing backwards and forwards, her breath hitching in her throat every time he neared the stairs. Her wolf was restless, knowing there was danger nearby, but she was going crazy about the fact that there was a strong, safe, male wolf just a few feet away. Her wolf could not understand why Cassidy hadn't wrapped herself around him like a boa constrictor and never let go in her weaker moments, nor could Cassidy. Yet with each thought of lust, a dose of reality would be delivered as yet again the front door would open, the pacing would stop, and there would be a brief, penniless exchange. No word yet, Alpha. Quite how long it took them to find 4 wolves, Cassidy wasn't sure. If it was Kane or people from his pack, which strangely Cassidy didn't think it was, then they normally weren't skilled enough to have hidden this many wolves for this long. Only skilled, well-trained wolves would be able to avoid detection for this long, which eased the guilt that had been weighing on Cassidy since earlier. A pang of worry occasionally echoed through her hollow chest as she thought about her girls, somewhere out there in the wilderness searching for her. What would happen if the male wolves found them first? She shuddered, unwilling to focus on the dark thoughts, and instead returned her mind to Jake, and the relative safety he seemed to promise her battle's scarred wolf. No, for the first time in a long time, Cassidy felt safe, and that scared the shit out of her. She should never have kissed him. she should have kept her distance. She had no intention of taking a mate, not that her wolf was in full agreement with that, but even her wolf knew that she had other priorities. They'd both lived through too much to then throw everything away for a handsome alpha wolf. Liam. The name had her silently leaping from her bed and slowly opening the bedroom door. She listened as the alpha and his beta exchanged general updates on the search. It seemed they still hadn't found anything. Cassidy sighed and cursed silently. She was about to go back into her room when Liam's tone changed and she paused, knowing that eavesdroppers never liked what they heard but risking it anyway. She needs to leave. No, Jake, Alpha, Jake corrected, his tone tight, his voice strained. Alpha, she needs to go. She's endangering the pack. Jake growled, no. Why won't you listen to reason? Even she knows she should go. What is it about this she-wolf that makes you unable to let her go? Do you even know why you can't let her leave? I didn't think so. I can't work out if you're horny or trying to save a ghost. Watch it, Liam. Okay, so at the end of the last chapter I promised you'd get to meet Cassidy's pack. I was wrong. It will be in the next chapter, though. So, consider this early update an apology. With Cassidy's pack chapter due on Friday, have a wonderful week. Thank you so much to voters' commenters. I've been really ill and seeing your comments votes has been such a lift. VF3 sometime after 4 a.m., Cassidy had finally fallen asleep. She'd waited until she'd heard Jake come back home, her breath catching in her throat when the staircase groaned as if someone was about to walk up it. Her heart had hammered through her body as she'd wondered whether she'd be able to turn him away, yet he never reached her door. Waking to bold, brilliant sunshine, Cassidy was surprised to find a cup of steaming coffee beside her. Blinking sleepily, she stretched like a lazy cat and then stood up, grabbing the mug and headed in search of Jake. He was still asleep as she neared the sofa, his pillow folded beneath his head. He didn't look as serene as he should, his face twisted in unknown pain. As he breathed in and out, mumbled words drifted to Cassidy's ears. She walked towards him, unable to help herself, her wolf at her heel with every step. As she stopped in front of him, her hand reached out and moved a strand of hair from his forehead. She smiled despite herself and basked in the quiet moment. He shifted in his sleep, responding to her touch, causing her to freeze in panic. Her heart hammered, untamed within her chest. At this rate, she'd have a heart attack before she ever found her pack again. She remained still as a statue, practically holding her breath until he seemed to settle. Backing away, she put distance back between them before turning and slamming the mug onto the kitchen side, hoping to wake him up. Maybe if he was awake then, her wolf wouldn't be begging her to go and cuddle with him on the sofa. Sure enough, within a few moments, he began to stir, before slowly blinking his eyes open, his gaze landing on her, a smile gracing his face. Her smile echoed his as warmth shot through her. She chided herself for her reaction to him and quickly looked away, busying herself with the mug as she washed it up in the sink. She didn't hear him near her until his breath tickled her neck. She froze, mug forgotten in the soapy water. Jake, she warned as he leaned forward, arms planted on the kitchen side on either side of her. Her wolf was practically purring traitor. She'd never been more aware of another person before, her body humming as though in tune with his. I promised to keep my distance. She chided in her mind, memories of the conversation from last night drifting back, sending a stabbing sensation through her chest. She was always going to leave. The fact that the pack wanted her gone shouldn't be hurting her. It should please her. She needed to leave. She'd been saying that for days, and yet she'd indulged her wolf and stayed, even though it was costing Jake dearly. Cassidy. He whispered as his nose trailed down her neck, as he took deep breaths of her scent. He had to stop himself from groaning at that smell. Nothing had ever smelt as good as her. His wolf wanted him to rub himself up against her, but he could tell from the tension radiating from her frame that if he tried that, she might kill him. A pissed-off she-wolf was a dangerous thing. His mind flashed back to Liam's comment about the scars on her body. Honestly, his wolf hadn't really noticed, uninterested in such a tiny detail. As far as he and his wolf were concerned, she was perfect. He wanted to know about the scars, though, where they'd come from, who they'd come from. Jake feared the answer, but also knew he'd need it eventually or else his wolf might go insane. Resisting the urge to touch her, Jake backed away and tried to casually lean against the kitchen island, but his entire body hummed with the energy swirling around her. He'd never met another wolf as potent as her. She seemed to relax slightly once he'd moved, which did nothing but annoy his wolf, though the man understood. She was in strange pack territory, knew there was danger, and yet also had their connection to deal with. Jake had lost count with the number of times he'd climbed the staircase, only to then return to the sofa. His wolf knew that this was more than wanting her now. It was bordering on a need. With every breath he took, he thought of her. He'd never been so solely focused on one thing before. The problem, though, was that with every step his wolf took towards her, she took one away. She was poised to run a past to escape, whereas he was ready to stand still in this moment with her forever. Last night, following Liam's exit, he'd gone to her, but she'd rejected him, and whilst Jake could understand, his wolf was not as forgiving. He wanted this she-wolf to understand that she belonged to him now and therefore could not put walls up between them. But Jake also knew that Cassidy had heard every word of his conversation with Liam, that she now knew too much and yet far too little. Most importantly, though, she knew that his pack wanted her gone. He barely fought back a growl as his thoughts turned to Liam and Eleanor. Eleanor he wasn't surprised at, no doubt jealous of his obvious interest in Cassidy. But Liam had been his best friend for so long that he felt like he was operating without a limb now, the distance between them evident in their pack link. Jake had woken this morning to find that Liam had shielded himself from the pack link, which some packs did, but Jake had never bothered. They were all like family. Just as the darkness started to settle in his chest, Cassidy turned and instantly his life filled with color again. On some level, he knew he should be worried about the effect this she-wolf had on him, but in this moment, he didn't really care. All he knew was that he wanted her close always. The possessive tug in his chest caught him off guard, not that he was surprised. Though he had never expected to mate considering his past, yet it felt different this time. Less pure lust and more animalistic need and possessiveness, no doubt a dangerous combination. I really need to. Jake saw what she was going to say before she said it. Let me give you a tour. He instructed rather than asked, eager to distract her from her need to leave. Plus, his wolf informed him, the intruders hadn't been caught yet. It was too dangerous for her to leave. Seeing the hesitation in her eyes, he continued, "We'll go get breakfast from Darcy's. I know she'll love to see you again, and then I'll give you the tour of the land. Come on." Not waiting for her response, he rushed for the door and held it open, too nervous to look to see if she'd followed. After a few unending moments of silence, she walked past him and out into the daylight. Relief flooded his system and Jake released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She wouldn't leave, not yet. He'd just bought himself a little more time to convince her to stay. "Thanks for reading. Question, does anyone actually like Liam? I'm not sure I'm a fan. Don't forget to comment, vote, etc." There was a sense of peace here. One that was carried on the wind and seemed to wrap around Cassidy's body as she and Jake walked in relative silence. Cassidy hadn't felt this level of peace in a long time, and as she watched the wolves in his pack go about their day, albeit with wary glances in her direction, she found herself becoming more and more relaxed. With every moment that she started to feel at home, though, a pang of jealousy would sweep through her. This is what pack life is supposed to be about, she mused. Having your pack around you, enjoying your life and raising your family in safety. This was the pack life that she'd once had. It was getting to the point where Cassidy couldn't cope with seeing any more happy families, with small pups running around their gardens, without a black ball of emotions beginning to grow inside her chest. As if sensing her growing discomfort, Jake cleared his throat. "This is where I work." She was surprised. First of all, because it looked like a little garage that was barely scraping by. Secondly, because she'd never known an alpha have a second job. Normally being alpha was enough. "You're a mechanic." "Most days," he answered in that same low, drawling tone of his. His voice seemed to bring alive parts of her that she thought were dead. Shaking off the need to shiver, she suddenly felt her wolf still, ears peeing back, lips curling to expose her fangs. She lunged for control, but Cassidy contained her, suddenly on high alert. Noticing her eyes shift wolf, Cassidy heard Jake growl as his eyes darted across the road. Jake's pack resembled a small town, rows of businesses and houses surrounded by open, green parks. She realized that this was probably the high street, with the garage, a couple of shops, and a diner down the road. Her eyes scanned her surroundings for the danger her wolf had detected. There she saw them, a group of maybe 15 wolves, all leant against the side of the small shop. At the front, a female she-wolf stood, her eyes fixated on Cassidy, sending her hackles up. Behind her, she could see Liam. Cassidy briefly wondered how hurt Jake was by seeing his friend, his beta, stood there against him. She wasn't even sure if Jake realized he'd stepped in front of her in a protective stance. She wasn't convinced he had. Jake growled and his stance lowered, readying himself for an attack if one came. Cassidy's wolf was ready, pushing at the leash that Cassidy held. She was ready for a fight. She went at a fight. She didn't remember the she-wolf, but her wolf seemed to, and she was not a fan. Eyeing up the crowd, Cassidy had already decided her plan of attack, knowing who to kill first in order to win when Jake spoke. Leave. He growled the word and sent alpha waves crashing behind it. If Cassidy hadn't been as strong as she was now, she'd have crumpled beneath them. One by one, the group's heads ducked down until only one remained, Liam. Finally, no doubt causing himself much pain, he dropped his head and submitted to his alpha. Trusting them to not attack and happy that they'd recognized his authority, Jake turned his back on the group of wolves who'd just betrayed him. He briefly wondered whether they'd have attacked Cassidy if she was on her own. Just another reason to keep her close, his wolf told him. Suddenly eager to touch her, he reached out and grabbed her hand before pulling her towards Darcy's. "Let's go get food," he ordered rather than suggested, as he dragged the reluctant she-wolf behind him. He had the distinct impression that if he hadn't diffused the situation, his little she-wolf would have sorted it, one way or another. That fact had his wolf growling in appreciation and the man following suit. What was this she-wolf doing to him? "Where are you? South Side, coming to you. We're about 10 minutes away. Any issues?" Cassidy glanced up as Jake moved towards her, clearly realizing that she was speaking to her pack. "Kinda. We were spotted yesterday, but we're okay. I'll meet you here." "It's so good to hear your voice, Saf." Cassidy smiled and focused back on the real world. "They're here, my pack are here." Excitement spilled into her words, and for the first time in weeks, Cassidy felt whole again. As though unable to help himself, Jake smiled back at her. It was a broad, warm smile, and one that sent a wave of ease over her and her wolf. "Which gate are they at? I'll radio in to tell the guards to let them in," he offered, pulling a radio from a clip on his belt that she hadn't noticed. No need. "They're here already." Jake smiled. "It's no trouble. They won't be able to get in otherwise. If they didn't tell you, I'll just warn both gates." "No, I mean." Cassidy cleared her throat, suddenly uneasy. Technically, her pack should have sought his permission to enter his territory. Technically, they should have used the gate. "They're already on your pack lands. They're a few minutes out." Jake chuckled. "No chance. We've got one of the finest perimeter alarms this side of the Pacific. There's no way anyone's getting through without being toasted by the electric current or without the alarm being tripped. It's no problem, I'll tell both gates." Cassidy's pack never had been very good at grasping the idea of no-entry signs, fences, alarms, or warnings. They were, however, very good at sneaking into places they shouldn't be. "Honestly, Jake, they've made it through. They'll find a way to get around the perimeter alarm, trust me." Something that looked a lot like doubt flickered across Jake's face before he broke back into an easy smile. "Okay, we'll know either way soon enough." Cassidy nodded tightly and forced a smile onto her face as Darcy began asking her questions about her pack. She tensed, ready for the question she hated the most. "How did you become alpha?" Cassidy's stomach twisted and images of pain flooded her mind, just as she thought she might drown. As the darkness clawed at her throat, a noise caught her attention. Her pack. Running as one tight unit, 3 sets of paws thudded against the hard ground and headed straight for them. She heard more than saw the 3 wolves beside her tense and drop into a predatory stance. Ignoring their bristling, knowing they didn't appreciate the new wolves on their territory without permission, Cassidy pushed past Jake and stood in front of him, smiling from ear to ear as her girls stopped at her feet, brushing their long bodies against her legs, the occasional tongue darting out to lick her leg, causing her to curse. Once they'd finished their greeting, she dropped to one knee and held her hands out, running them through their fur as they moved around her. "Home." she whispered as happiness chased the dull ache from her side and the discomfort her wolf felt in another wolf's territory. "Kelsey," she barked. "Yes, Alpha," she asked, a smile dancing around on her face. "I like it here. It smells good." Cassidy bit her tongue as a reminder of who Kelsey once was flashed through her memory. "Kelsey, where is she?" The girl smiled, a conspirator's smile, teaching him a lesson. She mimicked, her voice dropping an octave lower. Frustration ticked in Cassidy's jaw where Jay had been a loyal pack member since the day Cassidy had met her. Not part of Cassidy's original pack, Jay was the byproduct of a vicious alpha who demanded the ability to lay claim to any and all women in his pack. Born to a father who wouldn't acknowledge her and a mother who lived in fear, she hadn't had the best upbringing, and that was all Cassidy knew of her life despite trying multiple times to get more information. But she'd seen the scars, the ones that matched her own, and made her realize that Jay had probably had a very similar experience to Cassidy. Only, Jay had experienced it her whole life. Cassidy couldn't even begin to imagine how awful that must have been. More of a shadow than a real pack member, Jay was always lurking but never with the pack. But that wasn't to say she wasn't loyal to a fault as Cassidy headed in the direction Kelsey had told her to. Knowing that the two women shared a bond no one could understand, she feared for the life of the man who'd just shot Lee. Although every part of Cassidy wanted revenge on him, she knew that was not how it would work or should work. Not sure how Jay had even managed to get hold of the shooter, as she was sure that Jake had ordered that he was locked up. When she rounded the corner to find him on his knees and still breathing, she let out a sigh of relief. His eyes were wide and panicked, and his hands were tied to the tree behind him. He fought against the gag that bound his mouth, and his whole body shook with fear. His face, more bruised than skin, was nothing in comparison to his torso. Cassidy's stomach turned, panic seeping into her veins at the realization that Jake could seek revenge for this act. "Jay, don't do it," she warned to the trees that surrounded them. "That's an order, Jay, you have done enough. He killed her." Her voice was rough with emotion and an unspent rage. Cassidy turned and took in the appearance of the wolf who she'd barely seen in months. She looked thin, much thinner than she remembered. Tiredness was etched in each of her eyes, and her entire body held a fragility that Cassidy would never have associated with her. Despite this, she was still the toughest-looking wolf she'd ever seen. Taller than your average bear and hostility radiating off of her, she was one of the most brutal wolves that Cassidy had ever met. A fact that had proved very handy, time and time again. Cassidy's nose turned at the smell of urine. She glanced back at the whimpering wolf as he stared helplessly at the advancing she-wolf. "Jay," she warned, "you can't kill him. An eye for an eye, Alpha." She echoed words from days gone by, ones she knew might work to sway Cassidy's resolve. "Lee's not dead. Their healer saved her. Stop this. You can go and find her, or you can disappear and I will contact you when we're ready to leave." She'd spared a glance at the whimpering wolf before her attention drifted back to Jay, finding the space where she'd just been, empty. She sighed and ran a hand through her hair, wincing as she remembered the blood. Walking towards the tied-up wolf, her eyes scanned over his wounds. Sure, he'd live, but he'd never be pretty again. Jay had a thing for knives. Apparently it was in her DNA. Knowing how much pain the wolf was in, she whispered an apology as she untied his arms. She gently eased the gag from his mouth and apologized once again. "I promise Eleanor will heal you," she whispered. I was just protecting my family. My Alpha." The wolf stammered, fear still leaking from his every pore. I was just doing the right thing." Cassidy paused in her work and leaned back to look him in the eye. "You shot an unassuming wolf on sight. You are not innocent, but you didn't earn this punishment." She promised, "I'm sorry that I didn't get to you sooner. Just keep her away from me." A twig breaking caught Cassidy's attention. She watched as 3 wolves slowly walked from the trees. "Jake, get him medical help," Jake ordered to the 2 enforcers stood next to him. They slowly approached Cassidy, eyeing her suspiciously. She stepped back and let them work. "Jake," she called as the 2 men helped the injured wolf limp away. "Jake, I'm sorry." She never should have. Her words died at the look on Jake's face. There was so much rage, so much pain. She couldn't work out why he was having such a strong reaction. The wolf would heal. Her wolf had been shot by his pack member and she wasn't blaming him. Opening her mouth to say so, she froze as Jake charged towards her and backed her into the nearest tree. Pulling in a breath of forest air, ready to defend her pack. She froze as Jake's lips were suddenly on hers, his hands wrapping around her body and weaving into her hair. She had never felt so surrounded by another human being before. He drank from her body, hungry and desperate. He thought he'd lost her again. When that shot had rung out across his pack lands, it was like a blade had twisted in his stomach. For a second, Jake saw his entire life stretch out before him, the possibilities endless and the trajectory unsure, but only one thing was certain. The she-wolf who was quivering beneath his touch was everything to him and to his wolf, and he wasn't about to lose her now. And hello there. Hope you're all having a wonderful weekend and have enjoyed this update. There'll be more soon. 3 no. Her whispered protest stilled him, sending a falling sensation through his middle. Her tone, uneven, and her breathing labored. Her eyes were diluted with lust, a need that Jake was refusing to ignore any longer, mirrored in his gaze. We can't. She continued, wanton need written across her face, juxtaposed against her words. We can't do this, Jake. He growled before he could stop himself. Your pack comes first, Jake. Our packs will always come first. They don't trust me, and maybe they shouldn't. While she wasn't wrong, it didn't mean that Jake wanted to admit she was right. Jake leaned his head forwards, his forehead resting against hers. He breathed in her scent, the smell of her wolf wrapping around him and filling him, calling to his wolf. Cassidy shivered beneath him, and Jake's resolve to let her go nearly snapped. Mine. Jake growled, his eyes flashing wolf as he pulled away from her. Cassidy's breath caught in her throat, a want pulling at her insides. Her wolf fighting for dominance, fighting to acknowledge the claim in Jake's words. But what she'd said to Jake wasn't a lie. Her pack would always come first, and despite the feeling that she could find a home here, her pack needed her, and they needed her to keep them safe. Yes, she had her pack back, but it didn't mean that they were out of danger and she wouldn't be the one to get Jake injured, or worse. Biting back the words her wolf wanted to speak, Cassidy broke the silence that had formed in the forest. I'm not yours, Jake. You aren't mine. She placed a light hand on his chest and pushed him away. He could have resisted. She didn't use any effort, yet he stepped back. Cassidy couldn't bring herself to look at Jake and see the hurt written across his face. She knew it would mimic the feeling she had inside, and she couldn't bear the reality of it. Brushing past him, Cassidy walked away and headed off to find her pack, eager to make sure that they were okay. It was nearly time to leave again. Alpha! They chorused, slouched in various positions around the room. The warmth in their greeting and the relief at having them all in one place again almost lessened the cold, empty feeling she'd been trying to ignore since she left Jake in the forest. Back in the safety of his home, his scent clung to her skin. She decided that the only reason she suddenly felt better was because her pack was here, and it was nothing to do with being in Jake's home, surrounded by his belongings, his scent. Lee sat propped up on some pillows on Cassidy's bed, interrupted her thoughts with a whispered curse. Instantly, Cassidy was aware of the pain waves humming around the wolf. Lee, shouldn't you still be in the medical center? The she-wolf smiled grimly. They kept staring. I didn't like it. Cassidy rolled her eyes as she plonked down onto the bed beside her. Where's Jay? Saf, perched delicately on the other side of the bed, shrugged. Haven't seen her since you went charging off into the trees, a certain wolf following your tail. She teased, a whisper of ooze chasing her comment. Cassidy shifted and ducked her head, fighting the blush. Yay, well. It's nothing. Nothing. He protected you in front of his pack. He protected us. Saf fell into silence as she caught the glare on Cassidy's face, her wolf prickling her skin. He saved my life. That's all. The look that Saf and Lee shared went unnoticed. You bled. You burned. Kelsey whispered, making Cassidy jump. She knew she was in the room but hadn't realized how close she was. Kelsey stood right behind Cassidy, eyes staring into hers. Yes, I did, Kelsey. Cassidy stood up and turned to face her girls. Kane found me, I don't know how, but he did. He sent one of his minions and he stabbed me. She gently pulled the hem of her shirt up until the ugly, jagged scar was exposed. The knife was poisoned, so the scar hasn't healed yet, but I'm alive and safe, all thanks to Jake and his pack. We owe them, Lee said quietly. They shot you. I think our debt is paid, Lasaf cut in, her tone harsh in the silent room. The awkward silence hung in the air for a while until Cassidy noticed Kelsey staring at her. Her eyes looked odd, Cassidy noted. Her pupils larger than normal, her wolf flickering as though fighting an unknown force. When their eyes met, it was like something snapped inside Kelsey, as hungry eyes roamed Cassidy's form. Before Cassidy could scream out in warning, Kelsey spoke. "Hello, love." Everyone froze as all attention turned to Kelsey. Her face was contorted, a borrowed smirk lingering on her face. Her eyes looked harder than before, a cruelty she didn't own echoed in her features. Her voice had dropped an octave lower, and despite the words falling from her friend's mouth, Cassidy knew it was not intentional. "Kane," she whispered, her voice catching on his name as though her tongue refused to acknowledge him. Let her go. When Kane had first targeted Kelsey, he'd used tricks like these to isolate and confuse. He'd spent months slowly driving Kelsey insane, slowly ebbing away at her personality until all that remained was a familiar shell. That kind of torture she never stood a chance. No one did. Ever since then, he'd had the ability to speak through her, to use her a vessel, but only if he was close by. Pain surged through their pack link as Kane sent wave after wave of excruciating pain into Kelsey's mind. All of them felt it, but none more so than Cassidy, as memories flooded her mind, memories she'd fought so hard to escape. "I'll see you soon," he promised before Kelsey's face changed, her features more familiar and her eyes coming into focus. It was as though the room breathed out a sigh of relief as the temperature rose back to its normal level. It seemed brighter than before. "Alpha," a small voice whispered before an unseen force rammed Kelsey's head into the nearest wall and she crumpled into a heap on the floor. "And I'm so sorry. So sorry. So I know it has been weeks since the last update, and I apologize. Thank you so much to everyone who's commented, voted, and added to reading lists. And I'm sorry I haven't replied, thanked, etc. You are all incredible humans, and I really appreciate you taking the time, not only to read this, but also to engage and comment and vote, etc. I've been MIA for a while, firstly because I was ill, and then because I'm in the process of buying a house. Holy hell, I'm not an adult yet. I refuse to be an adult yet. Where's Peter Pan when you need him? So yay, I've been pretty distracted with that, so haven't been around, but I'm back. I promise I'm back now. So here's a bonus update with another one due on Friday, hopefully. Anyway, hope you're all enjoying this and having a great life. Speak soon. Also, quick question, do you think Jake will give up on Cassidy so easily? Watch this space. VF, the room had frozen. No one dared move a muscle. Suddenly, a shadow darted past Cassidy, towards Kelsey's body. Just as Cassidy sucked in a breath to scream at the mystery intruder, she faltered and realized it was only Jay. Where she'd come from, Cassidy has no idea. She spared a glance behind her at the slightly ajar bathroom door and the tiny window in that room, but shook her head. Trying to work out where Jay was and how she got to where you didn't know she was simply wasn't worth it. That woman was all stealth and absolutely no subtlety. She's not dead. A lesser person might assume that was disappointment laced in Jaytik's voice, but Cassidy knew it was just how she reacted to situations like this. Seeing Kelsey's immobile body on the floor sent Cassidy's heart plummeting to the floor. Panic gripped her entire body as she watched Jaytik's hands flutter over Kelsey's body looking for further injury. Cassidy spared a glance at her pack, and a small voice inside her reminded her that she needed to step up and be their alpha. They were scared, petrified, and needed to know their alpha wasn't. Even if Cassidy was shaken to her core, she couldn't let them see it. "Wolfsbane. We need Wolfsbane," she whispered as she stood and knelt beside Kelsey as she slowly began to open her eyes, confusion clouding her innocent face. Cassidy brushed a strand of hair from Kelsey's face as a wave of relief flushed through her. She was okay. She was going to be okay. They were all going to be okay. The others snapped out of their trance and rushed forwards, gently helping Kelsey to her feet and brushing her down, fixing her hair in the process. None of them spoke of what they'd just witnessed. They'd all seen it before, yet every time it served as a brutal reminder of their shared history. "We are going to have to give her Wolfsbane. It's the only way." Kelsey groaned a no, pain lacing her words. Guilt bit at Cassidy. She knew it was an awful thing to have to give her. Agony for a wolf as it would suppress her inner beast, but it was the only successful way they'd found of keeping Kane out of her mind. At first, he'd done it all the time. Dropped into her mind on a whim, just to watch them all, unnerve them all. It had taken its toll on Kelsey again and again and again. Finally, they found that wolfsbane would keep him at bay, but since they'd been running from their last safe place, they hadn't had access to it. It doesn't exactly grow everywhere these days. I'll go out and fetch some. I'm sure Doc will have it. Used for feral wolves, it could suppress even the most controlling of wolves. Cassidy ought to know. A shudder ran down her back, but she shrugged it off, determined to keep her friend safe, no matter the cost. Leaving her girls to tend to Kelsey, she turned and headed for medical center, betting money she'd find Doc there. Hello shorter update today, with another one due at the weekend. Thanks for much for reading, and to everyone who is voting, commenting, and adding to reading lists. Sorry I haven't had time to thank y'all individually, but I really, really appreciate it. It always makes me want to write more anyway. Have a great weekend, everyone. VF Cassidy jogged across Jake's pack lands, heading for the medical center. She was more than a little relieved that she hadn't bumped into him. He was obviously going to give her space. Although she'd managed to reject him again, she wasn't convinced she could keep it up. Despite her best efforts and the situation with Kelsey, she couldn't stop her mind from drifting to Jake. She wondered where he was, if he was okay, if his pack remained loyal despite their growing unrest, and if he kept thinking of her the way she did him. It frustrated and annoyed her that her wolf had become so attached. When she became an alpha, she'd known that from that moment on she didn't live for herself, but for her pack. With her wolf trying to convince her that none of that mattered without Jake, Cassidy was having a hard time trying to remain stoic in her choice. What she'd said to Jake was true as alpha. Pack comes first, and Cassidy had seen firsthand that his pack were unaccepting of her, and honestly, she didn't blame them. Her stomach tightened into a knot as a shot of anger chased through her. How Jake's pack could turn on him like that, she'd never know. It was driving her insane, knowing it was her fault. The lights of the medical center loomed ahead. Cassidy ducked her head into the growing wind and picked up the pace. If she'd have been anywhere else, she may have transformed into her wolf and let her run, but she couldn't trust that her wolf wouldn't go and seek Jake, rather than get the medicine her pack needed. Wolfsbane was a controversial remedy in the werewolf community. There are some who swear by it and others who claim it's only a weapon of torture. Having watched Kelsey take it for months, and knowing how it felt herself, Cassidy never took this step lightly, but she had to keep reminding herself that they were doing this to keep Kelsey safe, to keep her mind safe. Kane taking control of her like that was dangerous for all of them. Being an alpha meant making the difficult decisions, and this was one of them. Briefly, Cassidy wondered what she'd do if Doc denied her request. For all she knew, he might be one of the wolves against the use of wolfsbane. Not liking the extremes that her wolf was willing to go to help her pack mate, she quickly shook her head and rid herself of the thoughts. Doc seemed like a reasonable man. Surely he'd help them if he could. Eleanor. Cassidy greeted in surprise as the two women bumped into each other at the door of the medical center. Hi, I've been meaning to talk to you. Eleanor had stiffened the moment that Cassidy mentioned her name. Now she spun on her heel to face her, a look of death on her face. Anger and hatred radiated off of Eleanor, which began to rile Cassidy's wolf. Cassidy wasn't sure why, but her wolf hated the slight woman stood before her. She assumed that it must have been from when Eleanor healed her. Maybe her wolf didn't like it either way. Despite Eleanor trying to betray Jake by siding with Liam and the others, Cassidy owed her a debt. She'd saved her life and Lee's. For that reason, she was forever in debt to this healer. What do you want? Eleanor spat, hate dripping from her words like molasses. To say thank you and sorry. I know you don't want my pack here, and I know we've caused trouble, but I really wanted to thank you. You saved my life and Lee's without you well. I don't want to think what could have happened, so I just wanted to say thanks. And Cassidy paused as she noticed the shocked expression on Eleanor's face. She appeared speechless, her mouth opening and closing without saying anything. Fighting a smile, Cassidy continued, and I know it's none of my business, but please give Jake a chance. He's a good alpha, and trust me, I've seen some bad ones, so I know when there's a bad alpha in a pack. Honestly, though, he's great and he is doing his best. Being alpha isn't as easy as you'd think. So please, give him a chance to be the alpha you all deserve. Her shoulders had tensed at the mention of Jake, but now Eleanor seemed to relax slightly, as if braced for something worse. For a brief moment, something that looked a lot like regret flashed across her face, followed by anger. Her lip curled and teeth slid forwards over her gums as her eyes flashed wolf, causing Cassidy's to respond. Never talk about my alpha again. You're lucky I didn't die trying to save your sorry pack. You're right, you have brought trouble, so get out. With that, she pushed past Cassidy and headed off towards the forest. As she moved past, a faint but familiar scent drifted across Cassidy's senses. That sent cold, hard panic through Cassidy's core. Kane, she whispered as she turned and stared at Eleanor's retreating form. Cassidy watched as Eleanor was eclipsed by the dense tree line, then stared for a few moments more to make sure she was gone. Why would Eleanor carry Kane's scent? Deciding she was imagining things Kane at the front of her mind, she shook her head and turned, walking into the medical center. We've missed something. A voice shouted as feet thundered along the corridor towards Cassidy. She froze and waited as a team of doctors and nurses turned around the corner and disappeared, amongst shouts of code blue and get me the notes. Shaken by their shouts, Cassidy hesitantly rounded the corner from where they'd come from. She was greeted by a welcoming reception area. A woman with long brunette hair sat behind a large desk. Cassidy knew the woman had seen her, despite the fact that she never stopped typing. Stood awkwardly in the corridor, Cassidy was about to say something to the receptionist when a familiar voice spoke her name. Cassidy, Doc greeted, warmth coloring his tone. Doc. To her surprise, the old man pulled her into a hug. What can I do for you here? It's not your friend, is it? Does she need further healing? You're not injured, are you? The old man's eyes scanned over Cassidy for any obvious injury or missing limb. Panic sent his voice higher as a tense expression contorted his face. Oh my, if you are, Jake, no, nothing like that. She assured him, her heart hammering in her chest from the mention of Jake. I actually need a favor. I don't suppose you have a supply of wolfsbane. And hello, happy Easter to those celebrating. Apologies for the delay again, but I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think. What do you think is Eleanor's deal? To be trusted or not? Anyway, happy Monday and hope you have a great week. Thank you so much for voting, commenting, adding to reading lists, etc. It really is so amazing of you to take time to read this. 3 Wolfsbane. Doc's face scrunched at the mention of it, his weathered hands wringing. Not here. Suddenly aware of their surroundings, he placed a gentle hand on Cassidy's shoulder and directed her along another corridor into a small yet messy office. Books and papers piled high on every surface, with some just on the point of falling. Doc turned and shuffled his way through the small gap between the desk and wall before he practically leapt into his chair in a well-practiced maneuver. The room seemed to hold its breath as the air settled, each of the wolves holding their breath, as though waiting for the piles upon piles of paper to fall, yet they remained still. Cassidy let out a small breath, amazed at the amount of tension in her bones. She slowly, carefully, pulled the spare chair from beneath the desk and sat opposite Doc. As she sat, a pile went to fall, but she managed to catch it in time. As she righted it, she noted a folder hiding near the bottom of the pile, Liam's name written in a scrawling handwriting. Instinctively, Cassidy's hand reached to grab the file before realizing she had an audience. Clearing her head and righting the pile, she sat back into the chair and focused on Doc, who, whilst she'd been considering illegally stealing a patient's file, had dropped a large, old book onto the desk in front of him, and he was now poring over it, looking for something within its thin, fragile pages. Doc, she nudged, gently, after they sat in silence for a few minutes. Occasionally, Doc would mutter something before his attention would return to the words in front of him. Doc, she pushed again, eager to get back to Kelsey. Wolfsbane, you say? He finally muttered as his finger slid down the page he had open in front of him until it paused and tapped twice. Cassidy, suddenly nervous about his opinion, shifted in her chair and cleared her suddenly tight throat. Yes, it's for my wolf, Kelsey. Doc's attention snapped up, his aged eyes locking onto Cassidy's. Do you normally give her wolfsbane? You know the dangers of it for wolves? It can kill us in large quantities, poison us in small ones. I know, she admitted, hanging her head with the shame and guilt that it caused her, but we have no other option. He's too powerful and we've tried everything to stop him. Wolfsbane is the only thing that keeps him at bay. You see, Kelsey, she didn't used to be like this, all scattered and half missing. Car and Alp, a wolf, hurt her, badly for a long time. It was so bad that her body couldn't fully heal the damage, but "This was a wolf in your previous pack," Doc asked, book abandoned, elbows resting on its words. Cassidy nodded and shifted in her seat once more, leaning in despite the closed door behind her. Fear laced her words and worked its way down her spine until her breathing felt labored. "He was our alpha. She paused, not sure if she could say the words. "He maintains a pack link with her. I spoke to her earlier and realized she wasn't well, but I wasn't sure the cause. I'm assuming that whatever he did means that she's not able to sever the old pack link, meaning she holds both your pack link and his in her head at the same time." She nodded. "So what does he do with it to warrant wolfsbane as a way of diminishing it?" He uses Kelsey as a sort of broadcaster. He can control her movements and words. He speaks through her as such. He used to do it as a party trick, and then after we ran away, he'd use it as a way of tracking and scaring us. Now, he's using it as a way to torment me, to tell me that he's coming for me." Cassidy bit her tongue, aware she'd just given away more than she meant to. But Doc was so easy to talk to, and Jake trusted him with his life, which meant that Cassidy did too. She knew it was risky telling him all of this, but she also knew that she had an uphill battle to convince him that she needed the wolfsbane. It was a controlled substance within the wolf community. It was not something that you could get her hands on easily. "Do you know the dosage you normally give her?" Cassidy blinked in surprise. He was going to give her a poison just like that. Even though she was an invading alpha in his pack, tears pricked at her eyes with gratitude. "I can't find the dosage in this book. I really thought it was in here." He referenced the book before him but paused when he noted the tears running down her face. "Cassidy?" "Thank you, Doc," she whispered, realizing that he was always going to help her. He always trusted her whether he knew their past or not. "Thank you. And I'm so sorry it's been so long. I've just moved house and it's been crazy busy. I'm back, I promise. Sorry, 3, did you get it?" Cassidy paused for a moment and stared blankly at Jay. Cassidy honestly had no idea where Jay had been. She briefly looked around her to confirm her thoughts. Yup, not a bush, tree, or hiding place in sight, and yet Jay definitely had not been there when she'd first left the medical center. Yes. "Yes, I did. Here you go." She pushed the bottle of tablets into Jaytika's hand and watched as she disappeared back into the shadows. Cassidy stood still for a moment in the chilling evening. The wind whipped around her, bringing with it the sense of the various wolves nearby. Overhead, the call of birds provided a backdrop to the evening, yet it was words that Doc had left her with that sounded louder than any other sound. "Let us help you, Cassidy. Let Jake help you." When Cassidy had protested and tried to explain that Jake's pack was falling apart at the seams because of their arrival, Doc's only response was a knowing smile and a gentle reminder to trust in Jake. Stood there in the night air, Cassidy didn't want to move, yet her wolf wanted to run free across Jake's packlands. The wind shifted, bringing with it a new set of smells, something sweet, almost like honey caught her attention. "Jake," she whispered to herself. Her wolf seemed to lunge to the surface, eager to take control and go and see the one wolf who could calm the screaming panic. Now that she was alone, Cassidy felt she could finally allow the fear she'd ignored to take over. She shivered as the wind turned colder. Kane taking control of Kelsey should never have happened. It meant he was close, so much closer than they'd realized. She decided she would go and check on her pack. It was the most productive thing she could do, and she knew that Jake's pack would give them peace and quiet. As she walked, she paid little attention to the path ahead of her. Instead, in her mind, she ran over their options of escape or fight against Kane. He promised he was coming for her, but the question is, when? Another shudder ran down Cassidy's spine and she cursed into the night, wishing she'd grabbed a jumper. As if on cue, a door opened to her right, the light spilling out, sending the doorway's occupant into shadow. Cassidy blinked against the bright light, raising a hand to shield her eyes. "Cassidy," a familiar voice practically growled. She paused, her entire body frozen, every part of her flooded with warmth and her heart slammed against her rib cage. "Jake," she whispered in recognition. She wasn't sure if he'd moved or if she had, or maybe their wolves had done it, but suddenly they were face to face. Heat rose to her cheeks, her eyes scanning his face. He looked tired and worn out. Stress lingered in the crease lines of his face, an age he didn't own coloring his eyes. It had only been a day since she'd seen him, yet he seemed so disheveled. His eyes replicated her curiosity as they drank her in, no doubt lingering on the bags beneath her eyes, and the red rim from tears she'd never shed. She briefly wondered if he could read her, the way she could read him, when he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around her, cradling her in his body. His scent washed over her, her wolf responding in due course. Nothing had ever felt so right as a piece of her she'd been denying since the morning in the woods fell into place. This was the first time she'd felt whole in a while, she realized, as she instinctively buried herself in his embrace. They stood like that for a while, the moon their only witness, before they retreated from the chilling wind into the brightly lit doorway. Hello. Thanks for reading, and please don't forget to vote, follow, and of course, comment. I love hearing from you. D. Also, side note, I'm entering this story into the What Is 2018. Good luck to anyone else who's also giving them a go this year. VF he couldn't explain why he'd opened the door at that moment, or why he'd suddenly had a need for fresh air. In the same way, he couldn't quite put into words how it felt to see her. It hadn't been that long, he reminded himself, his wolf huffing in response. It was like he had been starving but not noticed, like a man without water until he saw her. Every part of him relaxed and sparked to life at the same time. She was home, his wolf reminded him. Jake still wasn't sure how he was going to tell this tricky little she-wolf that despite her continuing protest and lectures on the reasons why they shouldn't be together, he knew that he would never leave her. Space, he'd decided, would give her a chance to realize they were better together. So, for 24 hours, Jake had left her alone. To start with, she was sleeping only meters above him in his house, so he'd stayed at his garage instead. A fitful night's sleep in the back of the car he was currently fixing had been made easier with the memory of the way her body responded to his touch. Then, when he'd caught her scent earlier, he'd forced himself to stay away. His whole being had pined for her, but he'd left her alone, until now. Absently, he turned his head to face her, a hand trailing up across her shoulder, catching in her hair. He slowly rolled strands of his hair between his thumb and forefinger, freezing for a moment when she sighed and resettled on his chest. He wasn't sure how, or when, they'd arrived in this position. He'd thought they'd come inside and talk. He had so many questions nagging at him about her past, her future. Instead, they'd walked in. She'd asked him about the car he was working on, and the next thing he knew they were sat in the back seat, like teenagers on a cliff edge, somewhere between curiosity and need. He'd been nervous, he realized now on reflection, nervous at being so near to her. She was beautiful, did she know that? They'd sat in the back of the car, and just when he thought he might kiss her, she'd laid her head on his shoulder, and just like that she'd fallen asleep, with him not far behind her. When he'd woken to the briefest of sunlight escaping into the room, he'd been amazed at how comfortable he was with her against him. She'd looked so peaceful in her sleep, the stress of her life didn't seem to touch her dreams. He briefly wondered if he ever featured in that mind of hers. She featured in his, often. She seemed to calm the darkness that built in him. He'd never felt so calm. What time is it? He didn't mean to jump, but he hadn't realized she was awake. A little after 5. He whispered, rubbing his hand across his face and clearing his throat. She sat up, stretching her arms wide despite the small car. He longed for her heat against him, but said nothing. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, watching her with mild fascination. She barely suppressed a shudder. That voice, that damned voice. He should have to carry a warning for that voice, especially at this time in the morning. It rose up and down her spine, ghosting over her. "Yay, you." She smiled out at the workshop, glad he couldn't see her face. Slept okay. She'd had one of the best night's sleep of her life. No nightmares or faces, no hints of danger or darkness. Despite everything, she'd woken with a smile on her face. Had Jake replied, and she wasn't sure that he had, she would never had heard it, as suddenly a harsh mechanical scream stretched across Jake's parklands. Both wolves slammed their hands over their ears as a red, flashing light filled the room. Cassidy spared Jake a glance as they both rushed to climb out of the car, Jake already disappearing out of the door they'd entered earlier. Cassidy chased him outside, arms over ears, swearing under her breath. As she broke out into the cool dawn, her ears were filled with a blaring alarm. "What is that?" Cassidy shouted at Jake, who stood staring wildly into the distance. "What's going on?" Jake spared her a glance before his attention switched back to the horizon. "It's the emergency alarm. We're under attack," he shouted back, hand at his belt searching for a radio before he realized it wasn't there. Where the hell is Liam? He shouted again before sparing her an apologetic glance as he turned and ran towards the perimeter. Cassidy stood there for a moment, breathing harshly into the night. What the hell just happened? Saf. Cassidy shouted as she neared Jake's house. Her beta stood on the doorstep waiting for her. Are the others safe? Yay, a dog, we're all good. We've given Kelsey the wolfsbane, she's a bit out of it but she's okay. What was the alarm? Cassidy paused in front of her, her senses checking the forest around them. There was movement headed their way. I'm not sure. Jake said they were under attack. He ran off to see what had happened, and the alarm faded. I think maybe it's over. Saf froze, her face paling. Kane, she asked softly, almost reluctant to say it. Cassidy nodded. I think so. I need you to get the others together and get them out of here. Just keep heading west, I'll find you. Saf went to interject. They all fell down. Both she-wolves jumped, goosebumps shooting up along Cassidy's arms. Kelsey appeared from the darkness in the house, stumbling out into the night. Her face was ashen, her eyes slightly glazed. Kelsey, what are you doing? Where are the others? Panic swirled beneath Cassidy's skin as fear trickled into her veins. Normally, Kelsey would be practically unconscious from the wolfsbane. The fact that she was still up and talking meant only one thing. Kelsey, has Kane spoken to you again? She grabbed Kelsey's arms, her fingers digging into the skin. Kelsey. She snapped, anger bubbling inside her as she tried to make Kelsey meet her eye line, but the she-wolf's glazed eyeballs refused to focus. She needed to know, needed to understand what Kane had said this time. If he was here, if he had tried to attack Jake's pack, then Cassidy would find him and fight to the death for the people who'd saved her for Jake, but first she needed to know her pack were safe and that they would be even after she was gone. Alpha, stop, you're hurting her. Saf pried Cassidy's fingers from Kesley's arms. Calm down, it's not her fault. I'll go and check on the others, you go and see what's happened. But we aren't leaving you, Cass. Cassidy's wolf flared at the rebellion in Saf's tone. You will if I make you, she growled, her wolf putting her power behind the words. Saf fought the force, but eventually her head dropped in submission. Alpha, please, she whispered. Please don't make us leave you behind again. Cassidy stilled at the sadness laced in Saf's voice. Releasing her power, she watched as tears trailed down her beta's cheeks. Oh, Saf, I'm sorry. I am, but I made you all a promise to keep you safe. Saf slowly looked up to met Cassidy's eyes. You promised us that we'd all be safe, even you. You can't expect us to leave you behind, especially when I'm not convinced you'll come back. You promised, Cass. You promised we'd survive Kane. Saf's voice mixed with memories as the past merged with the present. For a moment, Cassidy lost all grip on the world in front of her, strangled by her thoughts. Her chest became tight, her breathing labored. On the verge of a panic attack, her spiral was interrupted by the sound of giggling. Snapping back to reality, Cassidy gulped lungfuls of air, her head snapping around to see Kelsey skipping into the night. With a curse, both wolves dove after her, struggling to keep up. They were heading for the perimeter, Cassidy realized. Doubling her effort, Cassidy sped up, leaving Saf trailing behind. Once within leaping distance, Cassidy jumped for Kelsey, her arms outstretched, fingertips hunting for purchase. She missed, her fingers trailing past the fabric of Kelsey's dress. She landed hard in the dirt, soil pushed into her nails as the dampness of the earth sunk through her clothes. Scrambling to her feet, she went to track the she-wolf down. When she saw that just up ahead, Kelsey had stopped dead. Behind her, Saf's footsteps thundered along the soft terrain, skidding to a halt at the sight before them. Liam had appeared from behind the trees and had paused Kelsey in her escape. They stood, stock still, staring at one another. Cassidy couldn't see Kelsey's face from her vantage point, but Liam's face was enough. It was a look that was more familiar than Cassidy was comfortable admitting, conflicted longing mixed with reluctant duty. They approached the pair cautiously, eager not to set Kelsey off again. When they stopped beside them, Cassidy was surprised to see that Kelsey's face looked confused, alive, her eyes blinking furiously as though trying to focus on what was happening. Kelsey's attention turned to Cassidy, their eyes locking for a moment, and to Cassidy's eternal surprise, it was the Kelsey that she first met who stared back at her. The foggy edges in her iris were gone, her attention focused clearly on Cassidy. "Kels," she whispered, reaching a hand out to touch her face. That was enough to break the spell. Instantly, Kelsey's face shuddered close, her eyes drifting out of focus, a serene yet false expression replacing the confusion. She began to mutter under her breath, and Cassidy's heavy sigh was chased by both Saf's, and to her surprise, Liam's. Saf gripped Kelsey's arm, eager to keep the wolf in place. Cassidy was about to order them both back to the others when Liam spoke. "He needs you." Her attention snapped to Liam, surprise evident in her expression. Liam, the person who'd sided against Jake over her presence here, was now saying that Jake needed her. "What?" she asked, kicking herself for how stupid she sounded. "He needs you. Go. I've got them." He motioned to Kelsey and Saf with his head, and although her distrust and dislike of Liam told her not to leave him alone with her pack members, her wolf knew it would be safe, that Liam would never hurt Kelsey and, by extension, her pack. Nodding tightly, Cassidy turned to Saf and mentally told her to watch her back. Saf widened her eyes at Liam, her eyes darting between both Liam and Kelsey in question. Cassidy subtly shrugged before she turned to leave. She paused, Liam. His attention briefly faltered from Kelsey to her. "What's happened? Jake said we were under attack." The use of the word we didn't sail past either Liam or Saf unnoticed. Liam hung his head. Only now did Cassidy notice the tightens in his expression, the sadness that radiated out from him. Cassidy's heart sped up. Had something happened to Jake? It's Doc. His mate, Darcy. She's been murdered. No, the words were an accidental protest, as though her body refused to accept the information. Not Darcy, not sweet, sweet Darcy. Cassidy had never run so fast. Her lungs were burning, as were her legs, but she had to get to them. Visions of Doc finding his wife's body filtered through her mind, of Jake finding the woman who was practically his mother, dead. She ducked her head into the wind and pushed on, until the sound of lamenting howls met her. The scene was chaotic. The majority of the pack had gathered around, obviously sensing the alpha's loss. Doc was knelt just out of view, but Cassidy could hear his wailing beneath the howling and chanting of the surrounding wolves. A sadness swept over Cassidy, duplicating her own. She could barely breathe, the sense of loss so heavy on her chest as she pushed through the crowd. They parted easily, either too upset to know who it was, or aware that the alpha needed her. Either way, she forged a clear path to the front. If it wasn't for the scent, Cassidy wasn't sure that she'd have known that Darcy was dead. She looked almost peaceful laid there, a bouquet of flowers placed beside her. At first, Cassidy wondered if it was a pack tradition to bring flowers, but then she caught a glimpse of the card hung from a black ribbon around the flowers, her name written in scrawling hand writing. Her insides dropped as her heart froze, cold ice slicing through her veins. Kane had done this. Doc knelt beside Darcy, his hands holding hers as though trying to force life back into her. His face was too painful to look at, his horror and agony etched into every line and wrinkle. Cassidy bit back vomit as her stomach churned. The sadness that hung over her threatened to suffocate her, whilst guilt gripped her tightly in its embrace. Just when she thought she might pass out, she saw Jake. He'd never looked so small or so lost. Stood in the crowd of his pack, he looked like the little boy that Doc and Darcy had rescued all those years ago. Ever since she'd arrived, he'd saved her multiple times. He'd been her strength when she'd had none, had protected her when she couldn't. He'd vowed to fight her past, to fight with her for her. He'd offered her his pack's life without ever meaning to, and now he'd paid the price. His eyes were glazed. She knew that look, knew that we would be reliving his nightmares. Cassidy had never seen him looking anything other than alpha, yet now he looked like he may fall apart at any moment. She scanned the crowd at the mourners with one eye on their alpha. Cassidy knew these situations were fragile. After a great loss, an alpha could turn, anger running through their veins. It was easy for them to go rogue, to lose the battle with their inner beast, but they could also be seen as weak, and disloyal wolves could use the opportunity to strike. She had a feeling that Liam wouldn't be an issue in this case, but Eleanor and the elders still might try to attack. They'd all been vocal about not wanting her here, and now their presence here had caused Darcy's death. No, she'd caused Darcy's death. She stumbled towards Jake, shoving people to the side. She would not let him give in to the beast and equally would not let him be overthrown. Every step she took was heavy, guilt and sadness still forcing the air from her lungs, but she had to make it to him, had to help him. Finally, she made it through the crowd, her hand reaching out for his skin. Her hand landed on his attention immediately snapping to hers. It wasn't until she saw the predatory look in his eye that she realized what a mistake she had made. The air shifted around them, wolves skittering to give them some room. The chanting and howling stopped, the noise dissolving into the night. All that remained was Doc's cries and Jake's low, warning growl. Alphas were renowned for being possessive and protective, especially in highly emotional states. They were also infamous at dealing with emotional trauma, and as far as Jake's wolf was concerned, this was only more proof of the danger Cassidy was in, of the danger that Jake needed to protect her from. Cassidy should have realized she should have stayed away, but then again, she hadn't been ready to admit what her wolf had been telling her since the moment she'd seen Jake in the bar. She hadn't been willing to acknowledge the obvious, the way her wolf longed for Jake, the sense of peace that she found in him. Nope, in typical Cassidy style, she'd ignored all of the warning signs and had instead chosen ignorance. Briefly, part of her wondered if Liam had known what he was doing when he'd sent her to him. Had he realized? Did he know that Cassidy and Jake were mates? Just thinking it sent a sense of dread through her system. Cassidy had promised herself she would never mate with anyone, had promised herself that she would avoid it until the day she died. She wasn't ready to commit, or settle, or acknowledge that she didn't need to be alone. She just wasn't ready for any of it, especially with Kane breathing down her neck at every turn. Jake's eyes narrowed, as if sensing what she was thinking. His entire body seemed to hum. He looked coiled, like a snake ready to strike, like a wolf ready to pounce. For once, Cassidy could see the true predator in him, and it scared and seduced her all at the same time. Realizing she had to escape, Cassidy had barely let out a small yelp as she turned to run before Jake gave chase, snapping at her heels. Shit, 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 shit. Cassidy yelled as she ducked and weaved across Jake's packlands. He knew this territory better than her, which is why she didn't dare transform to wolf if she did, so would he, and then all hope would be lost. If she could just get him to calm down, then maybe they could talk this out. Mate. That world rolled around in her head as she ran, distracting her from the dangers ahead. Every root she tripped on or branch her clothes caught on slowed her down. Jake's footsteps were behind her. She could hear them, feel them. She felt as though she could feel his breath on the back of her neck. She shook her head, trying to chase away the exhilaration and fear. She just had to keep running. Her lungs were becoming sore, but her wolf lent her strength. She wanted Cassidy to run. Cassidy's wolf wanted Jake to chase her. She wasn't a common prize. She knew she was strong and of alpha status, which meant that Jake's wolf would have to work to claim her. That was, after all, the aim of this little game of cat and mouse, wasn't it? The male wolf pursues the female. If he catches her, he gets her. If he couldn't catch her, then it meant he wasn't strong enough to mate with her. Fear gripped Cassidy's mind. She didn't want to be mated. Did she? Her wolf growled in response, traitor. Of course her wolf wanted to be mated. She'd wanted to mate with Jake since the moment she'd seen him. Sure, Cassidy had been suppressing her a lot the last few days, but the need was still there. That was maybe the scariest part of this for Cassidy, because eventually Jake would catch her, and eventually Cassidy would have to admit to herself that she wanted to mate with him. Yet it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that simple, not for her. Mating came at a price, one that she wasn't sure she wanted to pay. For now, she was favoring ignorance, so leaned forward and pushed herself harder. She knew that she was running out of packland and time. Jake was closing in on her. As the perimeter loomed ahead, Cassidy made a sharp right at the last second. She felt the gust of wind as Jake sailed past her, heard his feet skidding in the loose dirt as he changed direction, felt the growl rumble out of his chest. Breathing hard, she kept going, in her mind trying and failing to map out the packlands. Was it right towards the medical center? Or was it left? As though deciding for her, Jake's house suddenly appeared in the distant safety. She thought automatically, cursing herself for it afterwards. If she hadn't felt so safe in the presence of this wolf, then she'd have left long ago and would not be faced with a possessive alpha wolf intent on mating with her. Worst of all, if she had left long ago, like she'd constantly been saying she would, then she wouldn't want them to mate with her. Frustration made her jaw tick, her fists clenching. Anger bubbled within her, which was an issue as it let her wolf have some control. Too much control, and there'd be no hope for Cassidy. She skidded to a stop at the door, hurriedly fiddling with the catch until she managed to open it. She ran in, turned, slammed the door, and locked it. She breathed heavily into the empty house, surprised that her pack weren't still here. She hoped they'd left like she'd asked. A knock on the door made her freeze. Slowly, staring at the door as if waiting for it to fly open, Cassidy walked towards the door and looked through the spy hole. An eye stared right back. She jumped and stumbled back a few steps. Once more, Jake knocked. Cassidy. He growled, sending a shiver down her spine. She cursed at her wolf as she fought her leash. She wanted Cassidy to open the door and let him in. He'd won. He'd caught up with her. Cassidy should let him claim his prize. God damn it, no, she muttered, eyes searching the room for a way out. Every part of her wanted to open that door, admit her feelings and find a little bit of happiness, but she couldn't. Not yet. Not without ruining everything. Cassidy, let me in. Jake growled, his fist pounding against the wood. She briefly wondered if the door would break when her eyes landed on a familiar item. The long metal shaft was leant up against the corner of the room. In a few strides, Cassidy reached the tranquilizer gun. Her hands wrapped around the cool metal and brought it up to eye level. She wasn't exactly sure how it worked, but knew enough about hunting rifles to work it out. Tranquilizer darts sat on the floor in a small metal case. She quickly loaded two and swung the barrel of the gun towards the front door, just as the wood splintered and shattered, revealing a very angry, very triumphant Jake. Honey, I'm Homo. He stared down at his chest, confusion ebbing into his mind. A long metal spike attached to a thin needle hung from his chest. He looked up at his she-wolf as the world tilted on its axis. He gripped the door frame, all of the adrenaline from the chase just about keeping him conscious. He stumbled and leant all of his weight against the remnants of the door. You tranked me. Really? He asked incredulously, though he wasn't sure that's actually what he said, as even to him it sounded like gibberish. You like a light had been turned off, he hit the floor. Hard. Guilt niggled at her mind as Cassidy tentatively stepped forwards and lightly nudged him with her foot. Satisfied he wasn't about to spring back up, she sighed. Dropping the gun back against the wall, she turned around and stared at the soundly sleeping Jake, a little snore escaping him on every other breath. Now what? She muttered to herself. As though on cue, Liam stepped over his unconscious alpha and into the house. He looked down at Jake and then up at Cassidy, before shrugging once and moving into the kitchen. They're bringing Doc here, so we should move him. He motioned to the lifeless Jake. He'll be pissed when he wakes up. He promised as he leant down and picked up one of Jake's arms before letting it fall to the floor. Yup, he's going to be real pissed. The dread that Cassidy felt about that was chased by the relief flooding her system. She'd managed to avoid mating, which meant she'd managed to avoid telling Jake the truth, for now. Now she just had to face the rest of his pack, and most importantly, Doc. Where are my pack? She asked Liam, realizing she'd left them with him. Liam paused, his eyes studying her face as though trying to work out why she was asking curiosity or distrust. They're at my house. I knew the pack would come here, and having your pack here too would have been asking too much. Darcy was like a pack mother to us. His voice cracked. I know. Cassidy assured him I know what she meant to all of you. The distant pounding of footsteps and murmurs of voices paused their conversation. Liam's attention slid to Jake. We need to move him quickly. Hello everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful week life. Hope you're enjoying an alpha's alpha. The end is in sight. Kinda anyway, I don't know about anyone else, but I'm having issues with Wattpad's notification system. It keeps saying I haven't got notifications, or it deletes them. I've no idea what's going on. Either way, thank you to everyone for reading, voting, following, adding to reading lists, and commenting. VF Cassidy sat on the old staircase, her hair hanging like a curtain around her face. Her head sat in her hands. Murmurs of conversation filled Jake's living room, sadness lingering above them like heavy cloud. As though acting as a gatekeeper, Cassidy kept one eye on the living room and one eye on Jake's bedroom, the door slightly ajar. She was tired, her body aching and her mind exhausted. She and Liam had dragged Jake's body up the stairs and left him to rest on his bed. She'd hated leaving his side when he was in a weakened state, even if it was her fault, but Liam had promised to watch over him. Unsurprisingly, having her there when Jake woke up had seemed like a bad idea. So instead, Cassidy had made her way downstairs just as the pack members began filling the house. At first, they'd eyed her with caution, hatred lingering in some of their glares, but when Doc entered, all attention switched to him. He sat on the sofa, female wolves either side of him. Eleanor was keeping her distance, Cassidy noticed, her eyes red and swollen. Empathy flashed through Cassidy. She may not like Eleanor, but she felt her pain. Their eyes met briefly, and something that looked a lot like guilt filtered across Eleanor's face. Before Cassidy could see more, the she-wolf turned away and hurriedly left the room. At first, Cassidy had tried to integrate with the pack, keen to let them know that she understood what they were going through, but the whispers of it being her fault proved too much. So instead, she'd made her way to the staircase and hadn't moved since. A thump from above let her know that Jake was awake well. Technically, her wolf had perked up 15 seconds beforehand, which had alerted her. The fact that her wolf knew he was awake before she did worried her. She'd stopped Jake from mating with her, but it would seem that their wolves were linked either way. An angry voice, Jake's, was chased by Liam's insistent whisper. The room slowly stilled, ears straining to hear the alpha and his beta. Cassidy's heart pounded in her chest, fear and anticipation creeping up her skin. Her eyes locked on the bedroom door, her breathing becoming shorter. She briefly wondered if she should have positioned herself nearer to the front door, considering what she'd done to Jake. She was likely to need an escape route any second, and somehow she didn't think his pack would let her leave easily. In the end, though, she needn't have worried. As he slowly made his way down the stairs, her eyes searched him from head to toe, double-checking he was okay. When she reached his face, she'd expected to have those dazzling eyes watching her, but instead he kept his attention on his pack. He didn't spare her a glance as walked down past her and into the room. Liam followed behind him, offering her a small shrug at her questioning gaze. Annoyance pitted in her stomach and her cheeks flushed. She was hurt, embarrassed even that he hadn't bothered to acknowledge her. Anger would have been better than apathy. Okay, so she'd tranked him, but he had been pursuing her like a dog in heat. His pack all turned towards him, and as she watched from her perch on the stairs, she saw a side to him she hadn't witnessed before. As he spoke to his pack, described their sadness and loss and promised to find the culprit, Cassidy was awed at his ability to lead. She'd always struggled, despite having been taught from a young age how to rule a pack, but here he was, inspiring his wolves in their saddest moment. She'd never seen the leader in him before. She'd never seen the loyal pack before either. They hung on his every word, their sadness lessened by their alpha's promise to avenge their loss. Even Doc looked caught up in his words, his tears still tracing the wrinkled lines on his face. Despite the situation, she almost wanted to smile. All this time she'd thought Jake to be some country, laid-back alpha, more mechanic than politician. She could sense the troubled past in him, the same way he could in her. Maybe that was why they were drawn to each other, but here he was, doing what she never could, keeping his pack safe. Maybe that was why he ignored her as he walked downstairs. He'd realized that the real danger was her, and always had been that his pack were right. Maybe Darcy's death was a step too far. Hell, maybe finally getting a couple of hours' sleep had made him see her for who she was, made him realize what a mistake he'd been making. He nearly tried to mate with her for goodness sake. What had he been thinking? Whatever the reason, clearly Jake had had enough, which meant that she was in danger again, and so was her pack. Her wolf grew angsty, not happy at the idea of Jake hating them, but Cassidy was convinced it was true. In fact, now that she looked at him, she could sense the anger waves radiating from him. At first, she thought it was all pain, but her wolf could see it now too. His wolf was angry, waiting to pounce, just looking for an excuse. As Jake's speech drew to a close, he instructed the pack to head home and get some rest, informing them all that they'd hold a funeral tomorrow for Darcy. She didn't move as the wolves filed out. She wasn't sure why, but it had a lot to do with the fact that she felt as though Jake was watching her, even though he didn't spare her a glance. Even as he hugged his pack members, she could feel his attention on her, as though he had his wolf's eyes in the back of his head. Her heart rate picked up, hammering in her chest. She'd be having a heart attack at this rate. In the back of her mind, she reminded herself that she could leave. He was busy talking with Liam and some of the other wolves now. She could possibly make it to the door before he realized. Her arm flinched as though preparing to move, and just like that, his attention snapped to her. His eyes flashed wolf. In response, her own wolf launched itself against its cage, eager for control. The world faded into black and white as her wolf eyes took hold. Jake's stare didn't falter from her. In fact, she was 70 sure he was still talking to the wolves around him. But his eyes didn't blink, just watched her as though daring her to move. Slowly, Cassidy regained control of her wolf and calmed down, taking deep breaths until her vision turned back to color. In response, Jake's eyes followed suit. Liam lingered at the doorway, the other wolves gone. He spared a glance between them both before sighing dejectedly and heading outside, slamming the door closed behind him. And then it was just them, Cassidy and Jake, glaring at each other from opposite ends of the room. He went to move towards her, don't she warned, half in anger and half in fear. Her wolf lingered close beneath her skin, ready for any eventuality. He seemed to hum with anger and pent-up rage, be it from her endangering his pack or the tranquilizer. Either way, he was angry with her. He took a step forward. She growled under her breath and took a step back, slipping behind the kitchen counter. He kept coming but stopped when he reached the kitchen, the counter between them. He was respecting her space, her wolf's space, which meant that he didn't intend to kill her yet. He didn't speak, but nor did she. He just watched her calmly, his eyes boring into hers. She bristled underneath his unwavering gaze. Seconds turned to minutes, which lasted a lifetime. Finally, he blinked. His arm reached into his pocket and a small card skidded across the kitchen counter towards her. "Tell me who Kane is." His tone was calm, yet authoritative, his wolf lending its power to his words. It was not a request or a plea, simply a demand, and not one to challenge her authority. She realized, possibly slightly too late, that this was Jake the alpha speaking to her, not Jake the man who'd tried to mate with her only hours earlier. That must be why he'd respected her space. He was all business, driven by his need to protect his pack. Cassidy straightened her shoulder, sucking air between her teeth as she considered her options. She could tell him everything, she could. Or she could avoid the topic altogether. "I'm sorry for your loss, Alpha Jake. My pack and I will leave your parklands in the morning. I'm sorry to have brought this darkness to your door." She finished with a nod, effectively dismissing the conversation. Ducking her head, she went to step around the counter and him when his arms snapped out in front of her, blocking her retreat. His arm shook with anger, his eyes slowly traveling up to her, a mixture of unbridled anger, fear, and sadness in his eyes. It made her heart pang with sadness and guilt. She'd brought him so much pain. "Alpha Jake." She started formally. A bowl, probably designed for use for fruit, flew across the room, smashing against the wall. She stared at the shattered pieces before slowly turning to the heaving man next to her. His arms had curled in front of him, his fists wound tight. She could see him battling his wolf. "Jake," she whispered, longing to reach out and take away the pain, the anger, take it all away. "Tell me who Kane is." He half growled, more wolf than man, demanding the answer this time. Nervously, she ran a hand through her hair before retrieving the small card from the counter, eager to distract him. The card was familiar, the handwriting on the front confirming her worst fears. She slowly unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words before flitting back up to Jake. He watched her curiously, obviously eager to see her reaction to Kane's words, "I'll see you soon, mate." He hadn't slept this well in a while. Sleepily, he stretched, arms reaching over his head. An old shoulder injury protested at the movement, but he was too comfortable to care. Slowly, he opened his eyes, the outline of a she-wolf by the window sending his heart into overdrive. She shone in the sunlight, breaking through the gap in the curtains, her long hair rustling softly in the breeze from the opened window. Jake smiled and slowly rolled over towards her when her scent hit him. It was strange, twisted somehow. Sleep still fogged his mind, his brain slowly kicking into gear. Now that he focused, he could see that her hair wasn't brown, but blonde and not quite as long as Cassidy's. The scent was familiar, though, he was sure of it. He yawned and rubbed his eyes again, shaking his head to shake off the last of the fog before blinking at the she-wolf. His wolf huffed as he recognized her, losing all interest. Shelby. He hadn't seen her much recently, not since the day he'd met Cassidy, though he was sure she was one of the wolves who'd opposed him before. Slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes hard, her brows drawn together. She looked angry, she looked sad. Suddenly, a wave of depression washed over him as he remembered what had happened. Darcy. Poor Darcy. Nausea rolled through him. Seeing Darcy like that had been, well, it had been awful. And Doc, poor Doc. Worry, frustration, and a tiny sliver of fear rose up Jake's spine. A sound caught his attention he hadn't noticed, but Liam was sat beside him on a chair. Alpha. He acknowledged as Jake turned towards him. Jake couldn't remember how he'd got into bed or why he was so tired, but he knew it had something to do with Cassidy. Panic shot through him. He'd tried to mate with her, he'd tried to mate with Cassidy. Mentally, he kicked himself. How could he have let his wolf gain so much control? Yes, he was convinced they were mates, but that didn't mean he could abandon all reason and mate with her, especially not against her will. He sat up, his neck aching with the movement, his hand rose, checking the skin. Tranquilizer dart, Liam supplied as Jake's fingertip glided over a small lump which would soon heal. She didn't have much of a choice. Jake hung his head in shame. The loss of Darcy had pushed him too far and given his wolf the room needed to take control, but he was alpha. He couldn't afford mistakes. There was no denying that he wanted to mate with Cassidy and would do so, just not yet, not whilst the danger still lingered around her and now his pack. Besides, he barely knew anything about her or the danger she faced. I know. It's fine. Shelby, what are you doing here? It's not that he didn't mind her being in his home. He could hear that many wolves had gathered downstairs, but it was why she was in his room with Liam that made him question her. That and the fact that if the scent trail was anything to go by, she'd climbed in through the window. Her face was still a mask of anger. With short, sharp steps, she strode around the room until she stood beside Liam. Her hand fished into her right-hand pocket on her jeans, a small envelope appearing in her hand. She tossed the small card onto his bed beside him. He gave her a puzzled look, then Liam, and then looked down at the card. It had landed upside down, so he could see it had been opened. He picked it up and flipped it over, Cassidy written in scrawling black letters. His heart thudded in his chest, his wolf raising his head in curiosity. He yanked the small card from within the envelope and spared Liam and Shelby a quick glance before he read it. His heart damn near stopped beating, his wolf howling in protest in his chest. His fists curled, the card trampled beneath his grip. His breathing grew heavy, his eyes flashing wolf. He tried as hard as he could to contain the howl that wanted to tear from his throat. He and his wolf shared the same pain as the realization that their mate had already been mate-claimed, sunk in. Mate, her wolf growled at the word. Slowly, she folded the paper and dropped it back onto the side. She didn't want to see that word, mate. She bit back a shudder and slowly dropped her eyes until she was glaring at her hands. Briefly, she wondered where or when he'd picked the card up. Had one of the wolves given it to him? Is that why Eleanor looked so guilty? He cleared his throat, bringing her attention back to him. She knew he had questions. She also knew she didn't want to answer them all. There's something you've been hiding from me, he stated when she didn't speak. Her wolf whined in protest, half at Kane's claim and half at the deception. It was a dark memory for both her and her wolf, something that she never thought about, the one thing she refused to relive for fear that she wouldn't make it out alive the second time around. Fear and panic prickled at the back of her neck as a sweat broke out on her forehead. She felt her head began to ache before the room started to spin. She blindly reached out a hand for the countertop, using it to steady her. Her breathing became shorter, sharper, as her chest constricted. Memories, images, voices, sounds all blurred past her. The more she tried not to think about it, the more it came to the front of her mind. All the things that had happened to her pack, how they'd come to be, all of it wanted to spill out of her mouth. To her surprise, her wolf wanted her to tell Jake, wanted to ease the burden, the pain, but Cassidy knew she'd caused enough damage to him already. She couldn't share her horror with him too. She shook her head, unable to speak, trying to communicate with Jake that she wouldn't do this, and just as her head felt like it was going to implode, Jake's hand reached out and touched her flaming skin. Like that, the pain began to subside, the darkness chased out by him. As she calmed her breathing and her head focused again, she could only look at Jake. He stood silently, watching her with a newfound gentleness in his expression. Wasn't he as broken as she was? Wouldn't he, of all people, understand that she'd done what she had to do to survive? She took a deep breath. Kane and I grew up together after his father killed my father and took control of our pack. We were friends, but his father, he was a cruel, cruel man. He did terrible things to our pack, to me. The scars, Jake whispered. She could only nod. So he had noticed, she mused. It was something she was acutely aware of, her marred skin a public reminder of her history. I was the old alpha's daughter. I'd been raised to take control of our pack and everyone knew it. I was an obvious target. I could never understand why he didn't just kill me. Little did I know that it was because of Cain. He protected him, as best he could and in his own way. Slowly, Cassidy eased herself into one of the stools, Jake following suit. They turned towards each other, Jake leaning in, his eyes watery. Tears already spilt down her cheeks, but there was no stopping this now. Lee was my best friend growing up. When the new alpha took over, Saf joined our pack too. She was new to his pack, hadn't suffered as much. She'd been there a long time, too long. She paused, shaking her head, remembering the state of Jay when they'd first met. Kelsey joined us much later, not that it saved her any suffering. Jake watched as Cassidy paused, the haunted wolf looking out into the distance. He wanted to tell her she looked beautiful but knew it wasn't the right time. The pain etched on her face made his chest hurt. His wolf wasn't happy about it either. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to tell her it would all be okay, but at this moment he wasn't sure it would be. So, what about Cain? He probed gently, trying to distract her from whatever horrors she was reliving. She blinked and looked up at him as though coming back from another world. I killed his father. He was practically killing Saf. I had no choice. So I killed him, I challenged him to a fight, and I killed him. A heartbreaking smile swept across her face, sadness tinging every angle. It was the happiest and saddest day of my life. I thought Cain would follow me. I thought he'd understand that his father was cruel, too cruel to lead, but he became bitter, angry, and unstable. He decided to leave. A few wolves followed him. For the next 2 years, we lived the most amazing life. The pack became prosperous once more, the people happy. It was all too good to be true. Jake reached out, unable to help himself, and wrapped his hand around hers, which were clasped tightly. She flinched and then relaxed under his touch. A brief smile crossed her face before she continued. He struggled, trying not to say anything, eager not to interrupt her. But every part of him wanted to tell her what an amazing alpha she was, what an amazing alpha she could be to his pack. She watched him quietly for a moment, trying and failing to read his face. He just stared at her, waiting patiently for her to speak. She looked away, unable to hold the eye contact. Cain returned, demanding ownership of the pack. He claimed it was his birthright. He challenged me. Jake made a sound, distracting her for a second. He shook off the surprise and nodded at her to continue. We fought. I won, but I couldn't kill him. We'd grown up together, and at this point, I knew that he was the reason his father had never killed me. He wouldn't let him. He'd begged for my life on numerous occasions. I owed him. She paused, choking on her words, tears slid from her eyes. So I offered him a deal. He had to leave, and in return, I wouldn't kill him. He accepted. I thought it would be fine. She stopped again. Jake reached out again, resting his hand on her arm. It chased away some of the pain, but not enough to make it bearable. He came back that night. Turns out he'd changed his mind. He tried to force our mating. The growl that rumbled out of Jake's chest caught them both off guard. The hands that were gently draped over hers gripped her skin tightly as anger rippled through him. She shuddered. He failed and ran off, but later that same week he returned and attacked our pack. So many died. So many innocent people. She sniffed, wiping tears from her face. We moved the pack, left those packlins behind, hoping to put distance between us and him. It worked for a while. He left us alone. Soon, though, he began to cause havoc. He started attacking individual pack members whenever they left the packlins. Then he tried to see me. He'd follow me if I left our land or send threatening letters. He became obsessed. When I didn't agree to see him, he launched another attack in the middle of the night. Jake waited patiently, noting the change in her. She looked vulnerable, scared. He braced himself for what he knew was coming next. He bargained with his wolf, begging him to remain in control, begging him not to overreact. He nearly killed Lee. He offered her life for my submission. He promised he wouldn't hurt anyone else as long as I agreed to mate with him. I didn't know what else to do, Jake. I just didn't know what to do. She blinked back tears, her chest aching with the sadness she felt. It had been a long time since she'd faced these memories. She steadied herself and then practically whispered the words that made Jake's wolf howl in sadness, anger flooding his veins. I agreed. Her wolf whined at the memory of having to submit to a wolf less powerful than her. He bit me, mate claiming me, right there and then. She spat, shaking her head in anger as her wolf surged with force at the hateful memory. It was degrading, embarrassing. No alpha female should be mate claimed like that. She shuddered at the memory, her wolf huffing in anger. It was a sore point for both of them. Thankfully, before the new moon, I had escaped. We didn't have a mating ceremony, so his mate claim faded long ago, not that he'll accept that. He always calls me his mate. He believes we are still destined to be mated, even now, after all these years. At this point, I don't know if he wants to mate with me because, in his own twisted way, he loves me, or if it's because I'm the one that got away. Jake relaxed, stress and fear seeping out of him like water. His heart, which he hadn't realized was beating like crazy, calmed, and a sense of peace entered his wolf. His mate wasn't already claimed. The relief that rushed through him didn't surprise him. The she-wolf in front of him had become everything to him, his strength, his support, and he wanted to be that for her too. The fact that she was finally opening up to him had his wolf howling in happiness and his blood boiling at the hell she'd been through. Yet it also reminded him how strong his she-wolf was. After he mate claimed me, his pack and my pack merged, but he was more unstable than I realized. He seemed to go crazy with power. He was a feared alpha as it was, killing anyone who disagreed with him, but he became cruel. Kelsey bore the brunt of it. She was such a wonderful person, I sometimes think I still see glimmers of her, you know. She asked whimsically, glancing up at Jake, getting lost in his chocolate-colored orbs for a moment, before tears clouded her vision. Anyway, Kane found that through the pack link, he could manipulate Kelsey. She hadn't been in a pack before, not properly, she wasn't used to it. The more insane he became, the more corrupted Kelsey's head became. His favorite game was to spy on me through her eyes, often attacking me for something I'd said or done later. Any excuse to make me bleed. Jake growled again, but she ignored him, pushing through the painful part. Kelsey started to slip away, but it was when he stated that from now on, all matings would be organized by him, that I realized his intention. He wanted to force Lee, Saf, Jay, and even Kelsey to mate with some of his wolves. They were older, far too old, and just as brutal as him. I couldn't let him win, so one night we escaped and hit the road. We didn't get far before he used his favorite trick with Kelsey to find us. God, she paused, tears falling freely, steeling herself to punish me. He didn't lay a finger on me. Instead, he had the others beaten to within an inch of their lives. I have never felt such guilt before such horror, and she paused, crying heavily. She pushed back on the stool and stood up, pacing backwards and forwards, trying to control herself. Jake stood, trying to comfort her, but she couldn't handle any hands on her at the moment. The next time we made our escape, we were sure to be more careful. She paused, wiping her eyes, lifting her gaze to Jake. It was Kelsey's idea, you know, to lace her with wolfsbane. She knew it would likely ruin her mind, knew it would slowly erase who she was, but she didn't care. At first, she begged me to leave her behind, but I couldn't, not knowing what he would do. She shook her head. I couldn't leave her. She began pacing again. So we went on the run, skipping town to town to town, never staying too long, never going back where we'd already been. It was working to an extent until he nearly found us. We knew he was on his way. We'd spotted his scouts in the area, but equally, we needed the wolfsbane for Kelsey, so I sent them on ahead, fully intending to source some wolfsbane. Before I could, his scouts spotted me, so I ran and ran and ran until I hit your packlins. She paused again. At the time, I had no idea why I felt so safe the moment I entered your territory. Now, of course, it all makes sense. My wolf knew even then. Eleanor watched Cassidy carefully. Her eyes were wide in obvious fear, guilt evident on her face. Cassidy was stuck in a stunned silence, unable to think beyond what Eleanor had just said. What do you mean? She asked, internally wincing at the panicked inflection to her voice. Kane, I've met him. Well, once. I was out shopping off of Packlins when he approached. He told me that you were his ex, that you'd practically ruined their pack and then you'd run off. Cassidy flinched, anger boiling beneath her skin. Her wolf was 10 steps ahead, already ready to rip Eleanor's head from her body, but she took calming breaths, trying not to lose her temper before she found out the truth. I had no idea. I had no idea that he'd kill anyone. I just thought he was your ex. I thought he'd out you as the fake he said you were. I thought it would get rid of you. She stammered, her breathing fast and shallow. She was visibly shaking, Cassidy's angry posture probably not helping. What did you do? She growled out, voice low and deadly. She tried again to calm down, tried to breathe through the anger, but it wasn't working. I switched off the perimeter alarms on the south side. I told him how to get into the Packlands undetected, but I had no idea. I just wanted you gone. She tried to raise her hands in surrender, pleading with Cassidy for mercy. Cassidy's wolf sent out a power wave, one that had Eleanor whimpering beneath it. Eleanor whined and ducked her head, clearly suffering under the weight of Cassidy's alpha power. Anger was clouding Cassidy's mind, her wolf yearning to tear the traitor limb from limb, but the logical side of her brain was shouting at her, trying to get her attention. As realization dawned, horror flashed through Cassidy. If Kane had access to the Packlands, then it meant that nobody was safe. It meant he could get access to everyone, and that he'd left Darcy at the perimeter as a decoy. He could be right behind her, he could be hunting Jake as they speak. The traitor forgotten, cold shot through to Cassidy's core. Jake, she whispered before running back towards Jake's house. She barreled through the door, her heart racing. Her eyes scanned the room. Where was he? Finally, she saw him as he came down the stairs, hovering on the last step as he caught sight of her. Cassidy. He questioned, reaching the bottom step. She ran towards him, throwing herself into his arms, hugging him tightly to her. Her wolf paced within, not settled at just knowing he was safe. Kane could be anywhere. My girls, she whispered, pushing away from him. I have to find them. She turned to leave him, but he held her tight. Cassidy, what's going on? He urged, gripping her chin and turning her head towards him. It's Kane. He's here. Eleanor gave him access to the Packlands. He could be anywhere, Jake. The whole pack is in danger. He growled, eyes flashing wolf. You get your pack, I'll get mine. Meet back here, he promised, ghosting a hand down her cheek. He went to leave, paused, turned back around and leant down. Their lips met in a soft kiss, one that spoke more words than they had time to share. They lingered for a moment, maybe two, before pulling apart and each heading for the front door. As Cassidy ran out into the cool night air, she passed Eleanor, who sat in a crumpled heap by the door, her crying sobs chasing Cassidy's retreating form. She was halfway towards Liam's house when a shiver ran down her spine. Her foot caught on something, her hands grazing across the forest floor, wood tearing into her palms. Oh, for God's sake. She groaned out as she pushed herself back onto her feet, freezing as she did so. Her blood ran as cold as ice, an instinct telling her to freeze. She strained her ears, listening beyond the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees or the insects foraging for food, past the sound of her own breathing and out beyond the tree line. Cassidy ran with less urgency than before. Her body felt numb and as though it wasn't her own. Her wolf was in mourning inside her, knowing that mating with Kane meant losing her power, her freedom, her pack, and most importantly, Jake. Wiping tears from her cheek, Cassidy ran to Liam's front door and pounded on the wood. The curtain twitched and Liam's face appeared before a heavy lock was undone and the door was pulled open. Before Cassidy could speak to Liam, Saf appeared and engulfed her into a hug that sent both she-wolves sliding 2 steps back. Christ, Saf, I wasn't gone that long, she said with a laugh she didn't mean. I know, but we got word that Kane was here. I'm so glad you're okay. Cassidy held back the tears that wanted to fall and plastered a fake smile on her face, which she was pretty sure Liam saw right through, judging by the look on his face. To the top of Saf's head, who was still hugging her, she spoke. I'm fine. We're all going to be fine. I need you to get the pack. We're all meeting at Jake's. She urged, grabbing Saf's arms and removing them from around her waist, putting distance between them. Cassidy tried to smile reassuringly, but her sadness felt evident. Saf didn't say if she noticed, but Cassidy had the distinct impression she'd seen the truth in that look. Slowly, Cassidy followed Saf's retreating form inside the house, passing Liam as she went. He watched her with a steady expression, and she wondered what he was thinking, not that he'd share it. Wordlessly, he turned and walked into the kitchen, leaving Cassidy stood alone in his living room. Upstairs, she could hear Saf talking to the others, Kelsey's voice singing out above the rest. Cassidy smiled as she spoke of rainbows and parrots. Cassidy cleared her throat, looking down at her feet, trying to ignore the falling sensation in her middle or the tears burning at her eyes. It was time to say goodbye to her pack, to her best friends. They clattered down the stairs, a worried but vibrant bunch of she-wolves that she'd easily call family. They came to a noisy stop in front of her, their conversation slowly dying out as each one noticed her. "No," Lee whispered as the silence stretched between them. Even Jay was here, all 4 of her pack members, here when she needed them the most. She smiled and ignored the tear escaping her left eye. She shuffled awkwardly and let out a hollow laugh. "Come on, girls, we've been through worse," she promised, not meeting their eyes. "I need you to get to Jake's, we're all meeting there." They, of course, ignored what she said, reading between the lines instead. "Cassidy, you can't." Lee insisted, Saf glancing between the 2 of them, not quite catching on to what Lee had realized instantly. Cassidy smiled, holding back the words she wanted to say. "Come on, we need to go to Jake's. Kelsey, you ready?" The she-wolf span in a circle, a smile plastered across her face. Cassidy opened the door that had shut behind her, ignoring Lee's words and face, whilst hoping Saf would let it go. Jay walked past her first, heading into the cooling night. She paused next to her as Kelsey began spinning in circles, forcing Lee and Saf to try and calm her down. Cassidy tried not to meet Jaitik's unwavering gaze, but it was futile. They shared a look that said nothing, yet everything. "Alpha." Jay nodded before she moved outside and disappeared into the shadows. Cassidy watched her go, biting her tongue, squashing her need to cry. Next, Saf walked past, still confused. She could tell something was happening but wasn't sure what. She hugged Cassidy nonetheless and then followed Jay out. Lee looked distraught. She always had been able to read her. "I'm going to meet you at Jake's," she lied, trying to convince both herself and Lee. Lee rolled her eyes, tears staining her cheeks. Cassidy could see the anger flaring in her eyes, but also the acceptance which told Cassidy everything she needed to know her pack would be in good hands once she was gone and Alpha's duty was sacrifice. "I can't say goodbye to you," she whispered, her head dropping, heavy tears falling from her eyes. "You don't have to. I'll be right there," Cassidy gushed, sweeping her into a hug, loosing her tears in her hair. They pulled away and wordlessly, Lee followed outside. She wasn't sure when he'd reappeared, but Liam stood just behind Kelsey, lingering around her as he often did. When Kelsey didn't move, he sighed and brushed past her, their arms grazing. The 2 wolves jumped apart, making Cassidy flinch. Liam narrowed his eyes at Kelsey, a look flashing across his face that revealed more than he'd intended before he walked out past Cassidy, nodding at her as he went. She thought he was gone when he reappeared and, staring out at the night, spoke, "He'll hunt you to the ends of the earth, Cassidy. He'll never let you go." Fear rippled across her skin, a new sense of hopelessness settling in her. "He already has." She whispered, defeated. Liam turned, one eyebrow raised. "Jake." He clarified, "Jake will never let you go." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Cassidy's heart to sink, her wolf howling in sadness. "It'll be safer if he does," she whispered as tears tumbled down her face. She sniffed and wiped her cheeks as she turned to Kelsey, only to find 2 fully focused iris glaring back at her. "Kelsey," she whispered, stepping towards her. Kelsey smiled. "Cass." "Oh God, Cass." She threw her arms around her neck and pulled Cassidy close. "Kelsey, oh my God, Kelsey, it's you," Cassidy shouted, pulling apart so that she could focus on her face again. In the back of her mind, she began to wonder what had caused Kelsey's mind to return. She had a feeling it was something to do with Liam. Kelsey was nodding, a heartbreaking smile spreading across her face. Hope soared through Cassidy. Chased by reality dawning on her, her friend was back, just as she had to go. Cassidy's face fell, and Kelsey noticed, a hand reaching out to brush her cheek. "Cassidy, you can do this. You can beat him. If I can, you can," she whispered. She was right. Maybe there was a way. Maybe Kane could be beaten. If Kelsey could be saved, then maybe Kelsey's hand flinched, forcing Cassidy to look up at her. Her eyes had narrowed, her face harder than before. "Hurry, mate." She purred, her voice lower, unnatural and familiar. Cassidy gasped and stumbled back, putting distance between them. Just like that, Kelsey's clarity was gone, her eyes drifting towards the ceiling, the glazed expression returning. "No," Cassidy whispered, heartbroken as a false smile returned to Kelsey's face and she began to hum under her breath. "FCKU, Kane." Cassidy spat. Shaking her head, Cassidy stepped back to allow room for Kelsey to leave. She moved forwards to do so, but paused again, her head tipping back. So off the little lamb goes. Off, off, off until the big bad wolf comes to eat her. With that, she giggled and skipped out of the house. Cassidy paused, confused and a little creeped out before she followed her out, noticing Liam waiting for Kelsey just beyond the garden. With a deep breath, Cassidy stepped out into the night and left her pack to find safety at Jake's, returning to Kane as she'd promised. It's time to surrender to the big bad wolf. Kane clearly hadn't trusted her to return, despite Alina's life on the line. As the last of her pack disappeared, his wolves seeped from the tree line. Her eyes sought Kane's, his already locked into her. Slowly, she walked towards him, leaving Liam's house behind her. As she reached them, a familiar scent caught her attention, but with a strong gist of wind, it was gone. Good girl. Kane purred, distracting her from the scent as she stopped just in front of them. I think you deserve a reward. Cassidy bit her tongue, trying to stop a tirade of abuse from falling past her lips. Kane's hand rose into the air, his fingers clicking. Cassidy waited. The sounds of struggling and a muffled scream filled the night as Elena was thrown at Cassidy's feet. She betrayed you. I know you, Cassidy, you'll want to make her pay. You have the lust for revenge just like I do. So here is your chance. Punish her, he urged, his eyes alight with the promise of bloodshed. He wasn't wrong. Cassidy had always sought justice and revenge. She'd killed his father part in self-defense, but part in blood lust driven by the need to take revenge for killing her father and for torturing her and her friends. This was different, though. This was Elena. The woman who'd save her life, Lee's life, and probably countless others. To Cassidy's wolf, Elena's shivering, bound, and gagged form posed her no threat. Sure, she was angry with her, but she had no interest in seeing her die. Elena shuffled to her knees, and for a moment Cassidy thought she was going to run, until Leon stepped forwards and gripped her neck, causing Elena to whimper under his hold. Cassidy's stomach churned, anger and fear wrapping itself around her. I don't want her to die. She doesn't deserve to die. Cassidy spoke directly to Elena, trying to catch her eye. Yes, you did a bad thing. You betrayed me, you betrayed your pack. But that doesn't make you a bad person and certainly doesn't mean you deserve to die. Tears slid slowly from the corners of Elena's eyes as their eyes locked. Elena looked beaten, resigned to her fate. Both she-wolves knew that Cassidy's words were pointless. Whether it was by her hand or not, Elena would no doubt die this evening. Well, it doesn't matter if you don't want her dead, I do. Kane snapped, kicking her for effect. She ruined my plan. I'd fully intended to leave a few extra dead bodies around the place I do love to make an entrance. His smile widened. Maybe the next body would have been that alpha that you reek of. Cassidy's growl silenced Kane's monologue. He is mine. You promised not to touch him. Both her and her wolf roared in unison, sending birds flying from nearby trees. The world seemed quieter as the echo of her voice died in the night. Kane's eyes narrowed, his fists curling at his sides. You're mated to him. It was his turn to send wildlife scattering this time. He stormed towards Cassidy and brutally tore at the neck on her shirt, shoving her head to each side. He checked for a mate claim. No, you haven't. If he's yours, then why haven't you mated with him? Kane snapped, a hint of mockery in his tone. Because Cassidy stuttered. She was trying to remember all the reasons she had for not mating with Jake and struggling to come up with any. Why hadn't she again? She was sure there was something, there must have been. Something that was stopping her from mating with the wolf who she had a feeling she might love. The wolf who she was sure was her mate. She'd never felt so foolish before. All this time she'd tried to reject Jake. All this time she'd been causing them both pain, and for what? To save him from the wolf that had found them anyway. Her silence was chased with Kane's hard laughter. Elena flinched, still sniveling under the grip of Leon. Looks like you're all mine, mate, Kane whispered, hovering dangerously close to Cassidy. Kane motioned with his head for his wolves to grab her, heavy chains swinging from their hands. Cassidy's wolf screamed at her to run, but she knew that if she resisted then, Kane would kill Elena, her pack, and Jake. She hung her head, allowing them to walk towards her. Her body twitched as her wolf fought for control. She didn't want to give in. This was not how she planned to go out. The wolves reached her and pulled at her limbs, clasping heavy chains around her wrists and ankles until she was shackled. She couldn't run anymore. Kane watched the entire display, a sick smile playing on his lips. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen him happier. Go get the cars started. I want to be out of here before they realize we have her. Kane instructed some of his men. He turned slowly towards Eleanor, his eyes flickering between her and Leon. Kill her. He ordered as casually as you may order a cup of coffee before he stalked off ahead towards the perimeter. Cassidy fought and screamed as hands reached out and began to drag her away. The shackles bit into her flesh, their metal laced with silver causing her skin to blister. The silver was beginning to drain her power. It would make her sicker and sicker the longer she was in these shackles. Behind her, Leon pushed Eleanor to the floor. Cassidy fought harder, trying to twist out of the grip that held her, desperate to help save Eleanor. Eleanor whimpered but didn't move, didn't even flinch as Leon pulled a knife from the waistband on his trousers. Eleanor, fight. Cassidy screamed, begging the she-wolf to at least try to save herself, but a hand slammed across her mouth, silencing Cassidy's protest, an arm wrapping around her torso. The burning silver brought tears to her eyes, as another pair of hands grabbed her feet and they carried her across the woods, her strength slowly slipping from her body. In the distance, she could see 3 cars lined up on the edge of Jake's territory. Cassidy knew that the moment she left the Packlands, this would all be over. There would be no hope for her. She was crying, heavily now, as the reality of Kane set in. For so long she'd tried to avoid him, for so long she'd tried to keep her pack safe, and in doing so she'd missed her chance to mate with Jake. The only thing that was holding her together was the knowledge that now that Kane had her, at least her pack and Jake would be safe from his wrath. They reached the cars and Cassidy was set down onto her feet. She shuffled forwards towards Kane, who held open the door for her as he barked instructions to his men. Just as she reached for the cool leather, Kane's voice made her pause, his words slicing through her like a knife. Go back and kill any wolves you find, but bring me the alpha. I think he should see me claim my mate, once and for all. Cassidy's heart stilled, her blood running cold. She barely even had a moment to think before her wolf slammed against its restraints, desperate for control, desperate to stop Kane hungry for blood. And hello there. Hope you've been enjoying an alpha's alpha so far. I just wanted to thank all of you for reading, voting, commenting, etc. It means the world and I love to hear what you all think. The end is in sight, though I feel like I've been saying that for ages this time. I promise, the end is near. VF, she wasn't here. Jake had watched, his eyes searching for her face as the crowd piled into his home. He spotted Liam, 3 of Cassidy's pack in tow, but still no Cassidy. His wolf itched, urging him to go and find her. He was never a patient animal, but right now, knowing that his mate could be in danger, he could barely breathe. His eyes locked with Liam's, a silent comment passing between them. Liam had seen her and she'd promised she was right behind them, but she wasn't. One of her pack mates, Lee, he thought, was searching the crowd too. Her eyes scanning back and forth as she looked for her alpha, just as Jake did, though they both knew they'd sense her if she was here. As the last of the wolves shuffled in, the front door was pulled closed and Jake's stomach dropped. If she wasn't here, then it meant that either Kane had her, or she was dead. Neither option worked for him. It took everything he had not to leave and go to find her, but he had to put his pack first. He had to let them know of the danger and keep them safe. Doc was stood at the back, leant against the wall, a shadow of the man he'd once been. His skin had turned an off-gray color, and his eyes never left the floor. Jake's heart panged in sadness, the last 24 hours catching up to him. Darcy, how he would miss Darcy. He wondered if he'd look like Doc, gray, dull, and broken if Cassidy died. Would he be a shell of his former self? He knew the answer before he'd even thought of the question. The vague idea of losing her had his wolf in a tailspin. At this point, he wasn't sure which was more likely, that he'd sink into depression or turn rogue and have to be put down. Either way, losing Cassidy would have an everlasting effect on him. His hands curled into fists, his shoulders tense. He would have to get this over with quickly, and then he could go and find her and bring her home to him. Turning to his wolves, he saw their eyes each calculating his demeanor. The scent of fear washed off of Cassidy's pack, and Jake's anger wasn't exactly hidden. That couple with Cassidy's absence meant that they knew something was wrong. They could sense their alpha's pain. The Rootbridge pack are under attack. We are under attack. He began, taking in a shaky breath. They are being hunted by an alpha named Kane. He has falsely claimed that the alpha of Rootbridge is his mate. We believe he's on our pack territory. They evaded detection and impossible. Someone shouted from the crowd. a murmur of voices drowning out Jake for a moment. It is possible they didn't need to circumvent our security system because someone let them in. Unfortunately, one of our pack members was fooled into believing that Kane was an innocent victim. As Jake said it, he realized that Eleanor wasn't here. He rechecked the crowd to make sure he hadn't missed anything. Nope, she wasn't here. Panic seized his mind. Neither Eleanor nor Cassidy were here, and Kane was no doubt loose on his territory somewhere. Jake's flimsy restraint on his wolf broke, and without another word he transformed into his wolf and ran out the door. That, to his surprise, was held open by Doc. Jake paused for a millisecond, sharing a look with Doc that spoke volumes. He had no intention of seeing the man more son than most face the same mate-less fate as he was. Jake disappeared out into the abating darkness, intent on saving his mate. A wolf, its movement quick and deliberate, distracted Jake's wolf from Cassidy's scent. The two creatures stopped, eyeing one another up. Jake's human mind supplied to his wolf. This was one of Cassidy's girls. As they weren't in the same pack, Jake knew that he'd have to shift to be able to speak with her. When he'd met her in person, she'd seemed unstable, but her wolf was another thing altogether. Snarling, scarred, and fearless, it took everything that Jake had not to let his wolf overreact and charge her. Slowly, Jake's wolf relinquished control, allowing the man to be back in charge. Jay had done the same, though much quicker than Jake. He had a feeling that she was more in tune with her wolf, that she was as wild as her wolf would be. Jay didn't bother to hide her body, neither did Jake, both knowing that neither was interested. Kane has Cassidy. Jake's growl followed her words, his wolf pacing inside wanting control again. She tried to strike a deal. Her life for ours, but Kane has betrayed her. He's ordered his wolf to kill everyone they find. I have to get the rest of the pack out of here, but I need her safe too. Jay spoke with such authority that it surprised Jake she'd never chosen to become an alpha. She didn't need to make that deal. I could have protected all four of you. He ran a hand through his hair, worry clouding his judgment. Not just our lives, she made Kane promise that he wouldn't kill you either. Jaitik's words shouldn't have made Jake's heart sing the way that it did. Where are they? He asked. I'll go and find Cassidy and you can raise the alarm with the packs. Tell Liam, he'll know what to do. A look flashed across Jaitik's face that sent a shudder down Jake's spine. A cruelty he hadn't thought her capable of written in her features. It reminded her of what she'd done to one of his pack members, how scared the man had been of the beast with crazed eyes. Kane is our problem. Our pack knows how to handle this. You get your pack to safety, we will save our alpha. She countered, clearly wanting to claim Kane's kill for her own. Jake knew that there was some logic in what she'd suggested. He also knew that he wasn't able to leave Cassidy's safety in another's hands. Via the pack link, he sent Liam a message, telling him that wolves were on their way to kill and to prepare the pack for war. Have you found her? Liam asked. Jake didn't respond to Liam and instead turned to Jay. We'll work together. It'll be easier this way. Liam's getting the pack together to tackle the other wolves. You and I will get Kane and save Cassidy. Jay nodded, already her eyes switching to wolf and back, clearly ready for the change. As if on cue, a howl tore through the night, filling the void. Cassidy. Jake's wolf lunged for control, transforming on the spot. The howl was full of rage and pain and sent Jake's wolf teetering close to the edge of control. In the back of his mind, a voice whispered a warning of the dangers of going rogue. Both wolves raced across the forest, their paws thudding across the ground in sync, Cassidy's scent catching on the wind. Cassidy's howl surprised even herself. The anguish in it, the anger. Kane leapt back, his wolf recognizing a dangerous predator when it saw one. The silver burned her flesh as her wolf fought against her human skin for control. If she could, she'd let her out. As it was, her wolf was as trapped as Cassidy was. Despite the burning chains, Cassidy spun around and crouched, baring her teeth at Kane and his men. Her eyes were no doubt glowing bright yellow, her world in monochrome. Kane skittered back a few more steps as her growl dropped an octave. She wasn't sure she'd felt anger like this before. She knew she was as close to going rogue and losing all sense of her human self as she ever had been. Pain like she'd never felt before was tearing at her chest, every heartbeat building the pressure in her chest. Her hands had curled long ago, her wolf's claws sprouting from her fingertips and finding purchase in her palms. Secure her. Kane yelled in panic at his men, who looked unwilling to get anywhere near her. We had a deal. She seethed, her tongue catching on a fang and drawing blood. The act brought Kane's wolf to the surface. He'd tried to fight Cassidy's display of her wolf, tried to fight the alpha waves crashing over him, but his wolf could not ignore the scent of blood, especially when it came from a wolf that Kane considered his. Glowing yellow eyes promised an anger that Cassidy hadn't seen in Kane since the day she'd left. "Behave, Cassidy, or I'll kill them all," he promised. Cassidy scoffed. "You're going to kill them anyway, whether or not I rip your throat out." She finished on a growl. "Our deal was that you'd let them live if I went with you, but you lied." His face curled into a cruel smile. "What did you expect? You stink of that alpha, Cassidy. I let him live if he's touched what's mine." He growled, his fear forgotten. "We can make another deal," he offered, holding his hands up in mock surrender as he took one step towards her, his eyes sliding to someone to Cassidy's right. "Bullsh-t, come on now, mate." Cassidy flinched, her wolf lunging forwards, but in her anger she hadn't noticed the men flanking her or just how close Kane had got. By the time her ears heard the words, "Get her," someone had already grabbed the chains that held her, keeping her in place as Kane darted forward and wrapped a hand around her throat, tightening his grip for effect. "I told you to play nice, Cassidy," he warned, lowly. He nodded his head at the man to Cassidy's left, who then grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked her head to the right. "No," she gasped out, her throat constricted and eyes swimming. "This might be familiar," Kane whispered into her ear as he closed the gap between them. "To the first time I mate claimed you." Cassidy's stomach rolled as memories came flooding back, sapping the fight from her limbs. "At least this time we'll be able to complete the mating ceremony. The sun is rising, Cassidy, which means that the new moon is on the horizon. You'll be mine by midnight." He released her neck and placed a hand on her head to hold her in place, as if the wolf holding her hair hostage wasn't doing a good enough job. Cassidy's wolf knew what was coming, so did she. Kane's teeth grazed across her neck and she froze. Her wolf instantly stilled, submitting to the mate mark, knowing that if she tried to fight it, she'd die. When you have a predator's teeth in your neck, the last thing you need to do is move, not with the jugular vein so close. Fear stole her voice, her breath, her everything. "I'll make it a big mark, mate, just so that everyone can see it." Cassidy snarled, fighting the arms that held her, her wolf begging her to submit and survive. Her movement caused Kane's teeth to scratch across her skin, making her curse. "It might hurt, but I promise to make it feel better later," he whispered, his breath so hot on her skin that it made her shudder in disgust. His free hand traced her hip, his fingers edging beneath the hem of her top. As his fingertips met her flesh, heat shot through her body, though not in the way Kane would have preferred, not in the way her body had with Jake. No, she was an untapped volcano of endless rage. She was about to self-combust as anger burned white-hot through her. She would burn the world to the ground before she let Kane make her his, because Cassidy Alma, alpha of the Rootbridge pack, survivor of 2 evil alphas and more murder attempts than she cared to count, didn't belong to anyone. As Kane's teeth sank into her flesh, tearing through muscle, Cassidy's wolf stilled, but the woman had other ideas. Pain, rage, a darkness she couldn't deny. Jaitik's wolf ran on pure hatred, her paws thudding against the floor, the shockwaves reverberating up through her system. Cassidy. It was the only thing she could think of, the only glimmer of light in an ocean of darkness. Her wolf growled as though in response to the thought. Up ahead, Jay could sense Cassidy. Through the pack link, she could practically taste Cassidy's fear, her anger and her pain. She knew Cassidy, believed in her. Cassidy had shown strength that Jay could only dream of. She was her friend, one of the only people in the world who Jay would trust, protect, and die for if required. As they neared the perimeter, Kane's wolves began to seep from the shadows. As Jaitik's wolf tore them to pieces, she recognized a few. They were nothing but a familiar scent and a blur of bloodshed, but it was enough to enrage Jaitik's wolf further. As Jay bit down into the flank of the wolf who'd tried to pounce on her from behind, another wolf darted forwards and clamped his teeth around her hind leg. Her wolf threw its head back and howled in pain. She knew she'd lost a lot of blood, her wolf's energy sapping. Focusing on the mission to save Cassidy, Jay pulled on every last resort of strength she had left to shake the wolf off of her, claws digging into the neck of the wolf she'd been attacking. With a swift motion, she was free, her breathing heavy and body listing to one side. She was drenched in blood, hers or another's, she wasn't sure. She spied Jake. He was fighting off the last of the wolves who'd ambushed them. Jay knew there were more hiding in the trees. A voice inside demanded she hunt them down and make them bleed, but Cassidy was her focus. She gently reminded her wolf of their mission, who quickly turned from the scent of the men and headed off to Cassidy, leaving Jake to kill the last wolf. It was a good thing, Jay mused in the brief moment before bile rose and panic gripped her, that she had made it to the clearing first. It was a good thing, she reminded herself, that it was not Jake who'd seen the devastation. It was a good thing, she promised herself, that she could handle death. Hi everyone, apologies for the short update this week and the lack of one last week. Those of you who follow me will be aware that sadly a family member passed away. I'm hoping that next week updates will return to normal. Thanks for reading. VF Her wolf was quietly raging, a bottled explosion. Her wolf reflected a still lake, the surface so calm, unassuming, peaceful, despite the death and destruction the water beneath could cause. Bile rose in Cassidy's throat as her wolf forced her body to still. Kane's teeth tore through flesh and muscle, the pain searing bright across Cassidy's memory, conjuring past events from the deepest crevices of her mind. Everything in her wolf willed her to be still, to behave, but Cassidy could not and would not allow it. She begged and pleaded with her wolf to fight back, to not let Kane win, but it was to no avail. Cassidy knew that she had to take control, she had to break free, she had to fight. In one sharp, swift movement, she burst free of her wolf's survivalist restraints, tearing her arms apart with such force that the silver chain buckled enough for another tug to separate her wrists. She felt Kane's teeth dig deeper and drag through her skin as his hands clutched at her, trying to hold her still. She fought with every ounce of strength she had. She fought for every time Kane's father had beaten her, for every time she'd been shackled and paraded as a prize, for every moment she'd lived in fear of Kane, for every hit, punch, or bite that he'd inflicted. She fought for her father, for her friends, her pack. She fought for Jake, but most importantly, she fought for herself. Pushing against Kane's body, Cassidy kicked out at his legs as her hands fought his from her. In the confusion, his teeth slid from her neck, freeing her from the mating hold. Her wolf kicked back into action, angry and humiliated that Kane had tried to mate claim her. Cassidy felt her eyes shift as claws slid from her fingertips, making each punch she delivered to Kane that much deadlier. Fighting with her wolf at the surface, unable to escape due to the useless silver restraints dangling from each wrist, Cassidy managed to drag her claws across Kane's stomach, freeing her from his persistent hands. Jumping away, she was breathing hard, dizziness setting in. A small voice reminded her that she was losing a lot of blood, that she didn't have long left, but it was drowned out by the growl from one of Kane's men as they launched themselves at her. Whilst men fought her, others crowded around Kane, clearly trying to make sure he was living. Whilst she fought, delivering stab after stab of claws to the men around her, her wolf kept one eye on Kane, watching as he righted himself and pushed his men away. He wasn't dead yet, but that would soon change. Cassidy screamed out in anger and threw herself towards Kane, but arms wrapped around her torso, pulling her, kicking and punching, towards the ground. She fought harder against them, slashing at skin, the scent of blood pleasing her wolf. Kane stood before her, smugness radiating off of him as he watched her fight begin to fade. His men seemed to multiply, holding down her limbs. If she'd have been able to transform into her wolf, then she could have got away. But as it was, her human body was her only option, the silver still searing her flesh. She knew she was at a disadvantage, knew that her healing powers were practically non-existent, or at the very least, incredibly slow due to the damned silver, yet still, she refused to give up. Her arms clawed at their hands, even as the world started to blur in and out of focus. She refused to give up, give in, or let Kane win. The edges of the world seemed fuzzy, each blink a little longer, a little heavier. She tried to speak, tried to shout out at Kane to tell him he hadn't won, though she knew it looked like he had. Stood in the middle of the bloody clearing, only he remained practically unscathed, the wound she'd inflicted already beginning to heal. stood over her. He chuckled as the last of her energy left her body, the throbbing in her neck a reminder of the blood she'd lost. As the darkness came to claim her, she silently begged her wolf to save them both or die trying. In that split second, right before she succumbed, her only thought was of Jake. Jay had seen a lot in her short life. Born to a mother who belonged to the alpha, she'd endured a rough upbringing with an alpha more cruel than most. She'd been swallowed by the darkness, drowned in her own memories, and haunted by faces of the people she'd once loved. She'd seen children torn from mothers, lovers forced to kill each other. She'd even seen entire wolf populations decimated on the word of one bastard. In truth, she'd probably seen too much. Yet it was never the vision of the bloodshed or tears that lingered, never the gore that woke her up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. No, it was the noise. The eerie silence followed by the heartbroken scream. That was what kept her awake when the sun set. That was what followed her every movement. She'd always found that you could close your eyes or simply look away from the bloodshed, but it is the cries that follow you across the land. It was a noise that had her pausing, somewhere among the bloodied clearing she'd found herself in. Bodies lay strewn across the ground, pieces missing and chunks removed. She recognized the work, knew her alpha's hand when she saw it, yet it wasn't her alpha's gloating chuckle that greeted her. Her head tilted to the side, her eyes sliding across the ruby ground until they reached his feet. Like one might drag a razor, her eyes rose up his body until she met his face. That smug smile, she would tear it from him. However, he couldn't quite hold her attention, not at the moment. For by his feet, laid as though sleeping if it wasn't for the cloying scent of death that hung near her, was Cassidy. Loss, panic, and anger flooded Jatika's system. Her tenuous hold over her wolf began to fracture. Jay would go days, sometimes weeks, lost to her wolf, unable to transform back into her human skin. She knew that if she were to transform now, she may never come back, she may never want to if Cassidy was as dead as she looked. Kane chuckled again, a cruel smile twisting on his face. Jay shook, her hands curling by her side. She went to lunge for him when Jake's cry cut through her, an echo of the many she'd heard just like it. A lover who'd lost his love, a wolf without his mate. Hope reminded her that Cassidy might not be dead, not yet, but luck never had been on their side. Jake's wolf was let loose, the man lost somewhere in the transformation. Paws thudded across the sodden ground until Jake leapt up, soaring through the air, his paws connecting with Kane's chest, knocking the man to the ground. The two rolled some distance, coming to a stop just a little ways off from where Jay had been surrounded by Kane's men. Kane didn't waste time, transforming into his wolf, until the two predators began to circle each other, waiting for the other to show any form of weakness. They'd underestimated how big Kane's pack had become. They hadn't paid enough attention, too caught up in running from him to look back. His wolves crashed against Jay like a wave, unwavering in their destruction. As she fought off another of Kane's men, she urgently sent a message across the pack link calling for backup, calling for anybody, calling for help. They all fell down. Kelsey's voice echoed through the hushed room, a murmur following it as eyes slid suspiciously in her direction. Lee leant forwards, placing a hand on Kelsey's arm. "Not now, Kels, not here," she whispered, eyes scanning Jake's pack who were all piled into his home. Cassidy's pack sat to the side, segregated from Jake's, with Liam as the buffer. Any wolf that stared in their direction too long was soon put in their place by Liam. Lee tilted her head as she watched the beta glare at another wolf whose look had lingered too long. She wasn't sure what had prompted Liam's sudden switch in behavior. One minute he was trying to get rid of Cassidy, and the next he was protecting her pack, but she felt like it had something to do with Kelsey. Kelsey's eyes swiveled towards the door. Out of habit, Lee's attention followed, but frowned when there was nothing there. Just as she turned away, the front door clattered open and the pack's healer, Eleanor, fell through. Her face was bruised and bloodied, and Lee could sense the pain waves coming off of her. Lee felt a tug in her stomach, her body instinctively rising to go and help the she-wolf, even as others ran past her. Saf saw Lee move and shot her a look that spoke more words than she needed to hear. Saf had learnt a lot from Cassidy, including the ability to stop someone with nothing more than a glance. Lee knew Saf was telling her to stop, but Lee knew she couldn't ignore her calling. "You're too weak." Saf's tone was annoyed as it drifted across the pack link to Lee. "You'll end up killing yourself before you can save her." "You don't know that," Lee snapped back, the wolves rushing around them ignorant to the conversation going on beneath the surface. "I could save her, at least stop her from dying. Alpha would tell you not to." Lee's eyes widened at the power wave in Saf's words, shocked that her friend would try to use pack hierarchy to make her do as she was told. "You really think she'd stop me from saving the woman who saved my life? You think that she could?" Saf flinched, guilt flashing across her face. Ignoring her friend's guilty look, Lee stepped forward and began to push through the crowd of wolves trying to tend to Eleanor. When she reached her side, Doc was already there. His hands flitted across her with an experience that Lee would never have, yet she reached out and stilled his hands, sending a ripple of anger through the crowd. "I can heal her," she promised, locking eyes with Doc, willing him to trust her. "I can save her." Doc rocked back onto his heels and released a long, slow breath. "You better not be overpromising, kid." Lee nodded once, and Doc turned to the crowd, ordering them to back up and give them some room. "Whatever happens, don't touch me during this," she instructed Doc, before turning her head over her shoulder towards Saf. "Saf, if it gets too bad." Reluctantly, Saf nodded. The crowd had fallen into an uncomfortable silence, everyone watching with bated breath as the she-wolf laid her hands on Eleanor's still body and began chanting beneath her breath. Doc watched in wonder as the girl's hands lit up on Eleanor's body. She'd seen Eleanor heal, but it never looked like this. He could only stare as the injuries began to disappear from Eleanor's skin. First a cut on her left cheek, then the bruise under her eye. The wound on her stomach began to ease. The hissed breath caught his attention. His eyes snapped to the girl's face, a shudder creeping down his spine as a cut that mimicked Eleanor's spread across her cheek. Just as a drop of blood began to ooze from the wound, her eye blackened and bruised in front of his eyes. In horror, Doc reached out to brush her hands away, but the one she'd called Saf stepped forwards and placed a hand on his shoulder to stop him. But every injury she heals, she feels." He stuttered in bewilderment. Necks craned forward to watch, as Liam surfaced from the crowd. "Wow, that's cruel," Saf interrupted, forced to watch as wounds opened and then slowly began to close on her friend. "She absorbs the injury, the pain," she paused, her eyes wincing as a particularly nasty cut opened on Lee's forearm, "and then her body repairs it. She's too weak to heal her fully, but she can get her stable at least." Doc nodded, his head bobbing up and down long after the question had been answered, his eyes transfixed on Lee. "How does she do it?" Liam whispered as he moved beside Saf, blocking the view for some of the crowd. "We have no idea, and nor does she. So she fully heals the wounds." "Yup." Liam paused and hesitated as though scared to ask his next question. Saf rolled her eyes with impatience. "Spit it out." She ground out through her teeth. "Well, if she can heal anything, why didn't she heal Cassidy's scars? She's covered in them." Saf's eyes narrowed on his, anger bubbling below the surface. Her lips curled back over her teeth, her wolf entering her eyes. "What do you know of my alpha's scars?" Liam took a step back, knowing a predator when he saw one. I wasn't trying to be a dick. I was just asking." Saf's wolf stared at him long and hard, to the point where he wasn't sure she was going to answer, until finally she spoke. "Cassidy wouldn't let Lee heal them. She said she could never put someone else through that pain." Humbled, Liam went to speak when he realized that Saf wasn't paying attention anymore, and Lee had stopped healing Eleanor and now sat back, both of their eyes blank and slightly raised to the ceiling. Liam recognizes the look they'd had a message via their pack link. When their eyes blinked back into focus, their attention snapped to each other before reaching over the crowd's heads to Kelsey. All three wolves ran from the room in unison without another word. "And hello there. Hi everyone, just wanted to apologize for missing last week's upload. Been busy with funeral arrangements, etc., so just didn't get around to it. We are back on track now, though there may even be another update before next Friday as a little midweek treat maybe. Have a great week, thanks for reading, commenting, voting, etc. It's a great way to cheer me up." VF Saf's paws thudded against the forest floor, the smells of the trees, leaves and dirt filling her senses. Her wolf's eyes closed and she felt her mind stretch out, plotting the world around. Trees loomed and she easily sailed around them, On the distance of her senses, she could feel heartbeats mingling, blood rushing. She knew Lee and Kelsey would be close behind her, following her every step. She would track Jay quicker than the others. She could see further, deeper in the world than the average wolf. Most wolves would have slammed into a tree by now with their eyes closed, yet for Saf it gave her a whole new perspective, a wider view of the world. Jay, she could sense her, smell her scent carried on the wind. Blood, too, so much blood. Saf slowed, eager to make a plan before rushing in. Jay was the fighter in the pack, Saf the tracker, Lee the healer, and Kelsey, well, she used to be good with knives, but these days it was lucky if she didn't suddenly disappear mid-fight. They're about 25 meters up ahead. I think if we split up, we'll have more luck in surprising them. Lee, go left. There's blood everywhere, so Jay or Cassidy may need healing. Kelsey, you just. Saf paused, her wolf's eyes assessing the distracted wolf in front of her. Just try to stay safe. Saf nodded her head towards the fight in signal to the other wolves to go. With a deep breath, she turned and ran. So much blood, so much destruction, only one target. Jake's wolf reared back as Kane's teeth sunk into the flesh of his belly. The pain was lost on him as he spun away and lashed back at him, teeth gnashing together, just missing Kane's neck. The whole world was lost to Jake. Nothing mattered beyond killing Kane. His wolf refused to acknowledge the unmoving wolf in the distance, refused to admit what he'd lost. Kane growled and leapt forwards. Jake, distracted, stumbled back and landed with a thud, pain ricocheting up through his spine. Jake's paws held Kane up above him, Kane's teeth snapping inches from his face. Drool dripped onto Jake's face, blood mixing from numerous wounds. Using his back legs, Jake managed to kick Kane off him, sending him stumbling to the side. Jake leapt up and rounded on him, spying the flesh of Kane's neck when a voice caught his attention. Jake, she whispered. Cassidy wasn't sure if she was dead. She had a feeling she might be. Her body wasn't quite hers, her mind too drowsy, but that smell, the one tinged with iron, that shouldn't be there, should it? It was familiar, that smell, a smell that reminded her of danger. Something wasn't right. She tried to crack an eyelid, tried to take a look around, but her eyes wouldn't function. She tried to lift a hand, but her limbs wouldn't cooperate. A noise, something that sounded like an animal dying, filled her ears. What was that noise? A tingling began somewhere over her chest. It filled her with warmth, lighting every nerve ending. She knew this feeling. This had happened before. Lee was healing her. She'd felt this sensation before, knew the effort it took, the toll it would take on her friend. Slowly, she was able to open one eye, then two. Her vision was blurred but slowly focused on Lee's face. She looked pale, sweaty, her face strained as wounds opened and closed on her skin. Cassidy tried to tell her to stop, but the words wouldn't form. Just over Lee's head, she could see Kelsey. Surprisingly, she was taking an active part in the fighting. Cassidy could smell Liam nearby too, though couldn't see him. She coughed and pain arched through her, stealing her breath. As her limbs gained more strength, she was able to push Lee's hands off of her, the wolf going to protest before slumping backwards, knowing she was dangerously weak. Cassidy sat up, her eyes searching the battle. The number of wolves seemed to have multiplied. Cassidy couldn't tell who was on which side. She spotted Jay. She looked wounded but unrelenting, slaughtering anyone who got too close. Her heart leapt into her throat as she wondered where Kane was. Instinctively, her hand rose to her throat, searching for a mating mark, but it hadn't worked. Lee had been able to heal the wound, which meant the mating claim didn't work. Relief flooded her system but was chased by fear as the battle parted, and she noticed Kane and Jake fighting, Kane looming over Jake, ready to strike the final blow. Jake, she whispered, just as Jake managed to kick Kane off of him. Jake's head snapped towards her, his wolf recognizing her instantly, some of the tension leaving his face, his eyes screaming words they couldn't wait to say. But she'd made a mistake. She'd distracted him just long enough for Kane to regain his footing. She shouted out, trying to warn him, but knew it would be too late. Kane was charging Jake, Jake's attention still on her, worried by the look on her face. Cassidy could only watch as Kane's wolf launched at Jake, claws and teeth outstretched. He knocked the larger wolf to the ground, wrapping his mouth around his neck. He clamped his teeth tightly and shook. Cassidy's breath caught in her throat, nausea rushing through her. Kane's eyes raised up and locked with hers, a smile despite the wolf hanging limb from between his teeth. Without another thought, Kane threw Jake to the side, his body cracking as it hit a nearby tree. Jake didn't move again. The world narrowed, silence filling Cassidy's ears. The only sound was the rushing of her blood as the battle cries and howls drifted from her. She watched Jake, waited for him to stand up and move again. She waited and waited, but knew he wasn't going to move again. The angles were wrong. She could tell that from here. Everything was wrong. She took a deep breath, tears pricking at her eyes. Slowly, her eyes slid from Jake and across the mudded ground until she reached Kane's paws. Her eyes shot up across his chest and onto his face. She was still in her human form, and he in his wolf form. The silver still dug at her flesh to remind her of her limitation, though suddenly that didn't seem so important. Against Lee's protests, she climbed to her feet, her left leg not fully healed. With Kane in her sights, she limped across the clearing, his eyes meeting hers. Fire burned beneath her skin, her wolf tearing itself inside out at its inability to escape. The world lost color as her wolf took over and claws slid from her human hands. Half human, half wolf, she stumbled towards Kane, driven by an anger she'd never expected, driven by her need for revenge. A small voice reminded her that Jake was dead, but she couldn't handle that right now. She squished the voice out of her mind and let go, allowing her wolf to control her human frame. Kane got ready to pounce as she neared him, but at this point, she really didn't care. It had been a long time since Kelsey had felt the wind whistle through her hair. Even longer since she'd basked under the light of the moon. Caught between two worlds, it felt as though it had been centuries since she was last lucid and in control of her own body. But then again, it may have only been seconds. She cricked her neck and let her arms dance in the breeze. Her toes curled and dug into the damp earth beneath her as her lungs filled with the scent of trees, the earth and blood. So much blood. But there was something else there, something that had pulled her from her unconscious mind and brought her back into the real world. Snapping out of her small reverie, she turned her head to the direction her wolf had been running when she'd tripped, rolled and transformed back into her human body mid-leap, her mind in one piece for a change. She could hear the clash of claws and snarls of the battle forging ahead, but she couldn't quite bring herself to move. It wasn't that she was scared. When in her right mind she'd been a skilled fighter, no, it wasn't fear that had caused her to pause. Instead, it was a smell. One that had been weak but was growing stronger by the second. She turned from the sounds of battle and let her eyes scan the tree line in front of her. Her attention skipped over branches and leaves, small animals and birds, but paused when they spotted two glowing orbs. The look in them shot through her, her heart skipping inside as her wolf recognized the animal before it. A glimmer of familiarity echoed through her mind. Hadn't she seen this wolf before? Hadn't she smelt his scent? Flashes of consciousness replayed in her mind. A moment here, a hand lingering on her cheek there. She'd pieced together enough from her wolf's memories to know that she'd been more conscious over the last few days, but only now as the wolf emerged from the shadows and walked towards her, transforming as he did so, did she realize why. Mine. The words fell from her lips before she could stop them, the sentiment driven by her wolf but irrevocably echoed by her. She didn't know this man, couldn't remember his name to save her life, but both her body and her wolf knew that he belonged to her and her to him. In the back of her mind, a memory provided the cause. This wolf was her moon mate, the one's soul fated to intertwine with hers. An irrevocable bond, a bond not even death could end. The bond could give life, but it could also take it. If she died, he died, and vice versa. By the time her brain had processed what he was to her, he stood before her, as naked as she was. Their wolves watched from behind their irises. The two stood in silence, their breathing the only sign of life as they each searched the other's eyes. Kelsey. The man spoke her name as though he knew her. Jealousy panged through her stomach, insulted by her own ignorance. She went to tell him she didn't know his name, but he seemed to guess her words. I'm Liam. We've met. Well, I've met you at least. You are lucid, right? Insecurity flashed through his eyes, chased by a hint of fear. Kelsey smiled. Yes, I think it's because of you. I think you're sent. I think it's been bringing me back. She choked on the lump in her throat as a tear rolled down her cheek. Her hair shifted across her shoulder as the wind changed direction, bringing a smile to her face. What it was to feel again. How Liam whispered as his arm raised and gently cupped her cheek, triggering memories of the same moment from a deep crevice of her mind. I don't know. I think maybe the bond between us is healing me, she whispered, tears flowing now as a mixture of emotions churned inside her. Hope, heartbreak, loss, happiness. Liam nodded, hair falling across his face. I'd wondered. I didn't tell anyone that you were mine. I think your pack were suspicious. I think your alpha, Cassidy, knows. Cassidy. Her wolf growled, narrowed its eyes on her prey, and then launched forward, teeth catching on fur, but her opponent was quick. He danced backwards, avoiding her killing blow. She growled, lips curling back over her teeth. A low vibration hummed through her chest as she planned her next attack. Cassidy? Movement flickered in the corner of her eye, catching her attention. Her opponent took the chance and lashed out, claws digging into her front leg. She reared back and yowled, before darting to the left and aiming for the throat. Again he moved in time, even in his wolf form he laughed. Danger danced in his eyes, Cassidy's ears dropped backwards, her head lowering towards the ground, a growl growing within her. Cassidy, that noise. It was beginning to annoy her. She spared the sound a snarl before circling around her opponent again. Anger. So much anger was flooding through her veins. Destroy, murder, get revenge. Darkness was driving every move she made. There was something else, though, something in the depths of her mind, something bright, light, and glowing. Something good, something important. Cassidy, Kelsey yelled again, taking slow and steady steps towards the warring predators. Cassidy was lost to the wolf, unable to separate her wolf's drive for destruction from her own human pain. Kels, please, don't get too close. Liam urged, taking a step towards her but freezing when Kane's attention slid in their direction. I'll be okay, Liam, Kelsey whispered, holding her hands out, palm down in front of her as she neared the wolves. Cassidy's eyes slid to her before back to Kane. Please, Cassidy, Jake needs you, she whispered. At the mention of Jake's name, Cassidy's wolf let out a low, loud howl tinged with pain. Kelsey flinched back away from the snarling predator. Jay, help me, Kelsey shouted, eyes trained on Kane and Cassidy as the two angered beasts locked their paws, each fighting for the upper hand. Both of their bodies were littered with wounds, their breathing labored. Their wolves were relentless in their pursuit of dominance, Kane, driven by his need to conquer Cassidy, and Cassidy driven by her anger toward Kane and her need for revenge. Hurry, Lee shouted from beside Jake where her hands flitted over his still form. We haven't got long left. I don't know how to talk her down, Kelsey yelled as Jay stepped beside her and crouched, her wolf in her eyes ready to pounce should the predator's attention shift towards them. We can't. She's so angry. This isn't Cassidy, it's her wolf that we have to convince. There is nothing in this world that will distract her wolf from killing the man who's made so many people she loves suffer. Jay reasoned, eyes scanning the crowds for a solution. But it's Jake, Kelsey pleaded fruitlessly. She has to do it for Jake. As far as her wolf is concerned, Jake is dead. She won't understand what we're saying. She won't listen to us. Kelsey's head dropped forward, guilt flashed through Jay. She hadn't meant to dash her hope, but she had to understand. Jay was interrupted by a low growl that slid across the clearing. Doc, what the hell is he doing? Jay screamed at Lee, who looked just as surprised as she did. Cassidy groaned and rolled over, leaning her arm over her face. Her head was heavy, drowsy memories drifting across her mind. Where was she? She took in a deep breath and her wolf practically purred. Jake's house. His scent was wrapped around her, cradling her. Jake, was he alive? Her wolf's answering yip was enough to settle her fluttering pulse. Slowly, she opened her eyes and sat up, stretching her arms high above her head. Where was Jake? How did she get here? She twisted her arms in either direction, searching her skin for any sign of the battle she'd fought. Faint scars hinted at wounds, but her shifter healing meant that she was nearly in one piece, though that didn't mean she didn't ache. She groaned as she stood up, her leg protesting. Pulling down the fabric of her trousers, she could see a fading bite mark from when Kane had torn through muscle and flesh. That would take a while to heal. Kane. She paused, heart hammering in her chest. Was he alive? Had he escaped? Panic swarmed through her mind. Her breathing came out in short gasps, her hand slapping across her chest. Her vision swam and blurred as she steadied herself on the end of the bed. Just as the darkness began to close in, a soothing light echoed through her mind as someone shared images across the pack link. Kane was dead. Jay had seen to that. The pack link was stronger than she'd ever known it to be and burned bright in her mind. She'd never been connected to so many wolves before. Jake's entire pack were there, her entire pack. Cassidy bit her lip to hide the smile that tried to escape. Her pack, Jake's pack, they were mated. A frown crossed her face as she wondered when her wolf had accepted him as a mate, but she realized it was probably her, the human, who'd made the decision. When she'd been faced with losing him, she'd realized she couldn't live without him. Cassidy shook her head and knew she needed to see Jake, plus if her grumbling stomach wasn't mistaken, there was bacon downstairs. She skipped down the staircase and paused at the bottom. The house was quiet, empty. A plate of bacon sat half-eaten on the kitchen side. Cassidy grabbed a piece and went in search of Jake, using her wolf to sniff him out. The front door was left ajar, sunlight pouring in through the slim gap. She kicked it open and padded barefoot out onto the porch. Jake stood leaning against the railings, arms braced wide apart. He was tense but trying to hide it, the muscles in his shoulders flexing. She watched him for a moment in silence, a smile playing around her lips. He was alive. She stepped out and joined him in the light, standing beside him, millimeters apart. A long, abandoned cup of coffee perched on the railing post. He didn't turn to her, his eyes closed and a tranquil smile across his face. She smiled at him and turned to look out across the forest. Our forest, her wolf added. Cassidy's smile grew wider. Unable to look away from him for too long, and her wolf urging her to greet their mate, Cassidy leant her head against Jake's shoulder, winding her arm around his. When I found you. Sparkling lights drifted mindlessly in the breeze, trees creaking and groaning with the wind that surrounded them. Peace had settled across the forest, only nature filled the night with noise. Chairs lined up in tidy rows, their legs wound with greenery. Above them, the stars put on their best display. Specks of glitter littered across the Inkai midnight sky. In the distance, light speckled the horizon, the coming dawn ready to chase away the lingering night. Bathed in moonlight, she danced, a vision to anyone watching. She was lost to the wind that nestled itself against her skin, to the music that weaved through the trees to find her. She was lost to all but him. He hadn't meant to find her, hadn't meant to intrude on her moment. He'd needed solace, craved silence away from the bustle of wolves. He'd only meant to take a second to regain his composure, his untamed beast at his back. That was until he saw her. Both man and beast were silenced by her grace, her fluidity and strength. She too sought solace. She too sought silence. Mine, his wolf informed him as the she-wolf turned, her arms arching up into the sky and spinning in slow circles. She was the music, every flex of muscle and twist of frame, creating the next note. He'd never seen someone so free before, so unstoppably open. He was jealous. He was humbled. She was everything, ours. The man mumbled to his beast, agreeing with the sentiment but knowing it was never to be, never ours. He dropped his head, unable to look at her beauty any longer before he turned and slid into the shadows of the night. By the time that she'd sensed his presence, he was gone. Book 2 in the Rootbridge Pack series. Jay has been through a lot. A harrowing upbringing was followed by her and her pack being chased by a murderous alpha, intent on owning and destroying Jaytik's alpha, Cassidy. Now, finally, after years and years of being on the run, Jay is safe. She's always been on the outside, a lone wolf with just enough humanity left to attach herself to Cassidy and her pack. But now she's being offered a life in a loving, safe pack, with friends who are practically family. For anybody else, it would be a good thing, an amazing opportunity, a chance at happiness. But for Jay, there's just one obstacle standing in her way. The king is dead, long live the queen. She may have killed Cain, but his pack need an alpha, and right now, they think it's her. Cain's death has created a power vacuum, one that a number of wolves are vying to fill, but they need one thing, Jay. Realizing the biggest threat to her pack is herself, Jay forces herself to leave and set out on her own, but she should have known it would never be that easy. Whispers have traveled about Cassidy's protector, about the woman more wolf than most. Alpha of the Black Oath pack, Logan Black, has been watching Jay for a while now. Sure, he tried to stop himself, but his wolf is obsessed, and so is he. Knowing he can never truly have her, he resigns himself to being her unofficial stalker, protector, and guardian angel. So, when an underprepared alpha tries to capture her, He readies himself to go to her defense, but he should have known better. As he watches Jay destroy the pack who'd been sent to capture her, he realizes that maybe, just maybe, he's found the only wolf in existence strong enough to match him, strong enough to be his mate, strong enough to kill him. However, when it comes down to it, Logan can't quite bring himself to ask the woman of his dreams to end his life, so instead lets her go, and that's where it all goes wrong. And Chapter 1 of An Alpha's Claim will be out next Friday. Follow me for updates. Hey everyone, apologies for the delay with the sequel, but it is finally up. Go check it out now. An Alpha's Claim Chapter 1-2 are out now, with further updates every Friday. Thanks for reading, V.